I took a drive late one night. What happened will haunt me for the rest of my life. Oh, before I forget, man, I was wondering if you could help me with something. The cashier, an acne-riddled kid who looked to be in his late teens or early 20s, looked up from shoving the bag of potato chips, 2 sodas, and a pack of Lucky Strikes into a plastic bag. For a moment, he just stood there, seemingly frozen in mid-action. Then he finally answered, "Yeah, what's up, man?" I let out a barely perceptible sigh. I'd been half afraid that I would be told to take a long walk off a short pier, to put it politely. Feeling relieved, I reached into my back pocket for what was there. You see, I seem to have, well, sort of gotten lost out here. I decided to take a late-night drive and ended up getting turned around on all these 2-lane back roads. I unfolded the map and set it on the counter so he and I could both see it before continuing. So, I was hoping you could point out on here roughly where we are, and more importantly, the way to get back to the main road. There was another long stretch of silence, and then the kid began to laugh, softly at first and then louder. "Dude, a paper map?" he managed out between wheezes. "Are you for real? What year do you think this is? 1993? For my part, I simply let out a resigned sigh. I'd had a bad feeling I would be getting this sort of reaction from someone his age, and it looked like I'd been proven correct. Can't say I didn't see it coming. He wiped tears from the corners of his eyes and looked at me. "Seriously, bro, don't you have GPS in your car or something?" he asked. Immediately, I hooked a thumb over my shoulder, pointing out the glass entry door at the beige sedan sitting at the gas pumps. "Not in a Honda Accord from 1979, I replied simply. As he looked behind me out the door, I could see he wanted to make another quip, probably something about how I should buy a newer car or something. Thankfully, though, he kept it to himself. Instead, he leaned over the map and, still chuckling softly to himself, began looking at it. A few moments later, he snapped his fingers. "Ha! I still got it," he said proudly, then pushed his finger down near the middle of the map and looked up at me. "We're right about here, roughly 6 or 7 miles outside Placer." I leaned over the counter to see as he drew his finger away. "Here?" He nodded, and I pulled a pen out of my pocket, circling the area as a reminder once I left, then examined the map further. "Okay, so it seems I could take more than a few roads to get back to Interstate 5, right?" The kid nodded again, clearly already bored with the unusual interaction, by the slightly annoyed look which had begun to cross his face. "Sure," he said simply, then placed my bagged items on top of the map. "That'll be $14.50 for this, and $28.50 for the gas." I reached into my pocket and pulled my wallet out, withdrawing 3 20s and handing them to him. The register let out its trademark ding as it shot open, and he placed the bills in it before pulling out and handing me my change. Placing it and my wallet back into my pocket, I picked up the bag and folded the map back up. "Thanks for the help," I said as I turned to head out the door. "Yeah, no problem," I heard him mutter at me as I crossed to the front door and pushed it open. A small bell hung from the inside handle jangled as I stepped outside and let the door swing shut behind me. The sounds of the refrigerators humming and the fluorescent lights softly buzzing was replaced by those of a summertime forest at night. Crickets and cicadas buzzed loudly in the grass around the store, almost overwhelming the buzzing sound of the lights over the pumps. The sound of an owl hooting loudly echoed through the trees, followed by the loud call of what had to be an elk. I inhaled the clean air before heading down the steps from my car. Pulling open the driver's door, I took one last look around before dropping into the driver's seat. "So, did you find out where we are?" asked a voice from the passenger seat. For a split second, a wave of confusion and panic swept over me, and I spun in my seat. It was immediately replaced by a wave of embarrassment, amplified as my friend began to let out a deep laugh. "Dude, were you in there that long that you forgot I was out here waiting for you?" Not wanting to admit I had done just that, I shook my head. "Nah, bro, not that. Just dealing with the kid in there was a major headache." He nodded sympathetically. Craig was one of my close friends. Ever since we'd met each other, we'd immediately clicked and had stuck with each other from that point on. And one thing we both loved to do was take late-night drives to nowhere, simply driving around with no destination in mind, listening to the radio and occasionally sharing a joint one of us would buy. This is the first time we've ever gotten lost, though. Ever. I reached into the bag, pulling out the bottle of Mr. Pibb and handing it to him. Here, I said simply, before pulling the Lucky Strikes out and chucking the rest into the back seat. Pulling the key from my pocket, I slid it into the ignition and turned it, the car's buzzer sounding as the dash lights came on. A moment later, the inline four quietly rumbled to life with its traditional burble. Tearing open the packaging, I pulled a cigarette from the pack and stuck it into the corner of my mouth before reaching to push in the car's cigarette lighter. As I did, I shot a glance back towards the store and froze. A small shiver shot down my spine as I realized the kid was standing at the door and staring out at us. What the actual hell? Craig caught my gaze and turned to look himself. Dude, what the hell is his problem? I shook my head as the lighter popped back out, signaling it was ready to use. I pushed the glowing red coil against the tip of the smoke for a moment until it was lit, then placed it back in its slot. I pulled it from my lips and exhaled a cloud of smoke before answering, feeling more than a bit unnerved. I don't know, but honestly, man, that's more than a bit creepy. I shot one last glance. The kid hadn't even blinked once. He was just staring with an off-putting intensity out the glass. Come on, let's get out of here, Craig said, echoing the thoughts swimming through my mind. I put the car into first gear and eased off the clutch, the car beginning to roll forward. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him turn and shoot the bird at the kid as we slid out from under the lights into the dark. Prick, I heard him mumble. I turned the car left and began heading back the way we came. Well, the good thing is, yeah, I did find out where we are. I pulled the map from my pocket and handed it to my friend. I heard him fumbling for a moment, and then a small flashlight clicked on as he aimed it at the map. Dude, how did we make it almost as far east as Placer? He asked with a slightly astonished tone. Longer drive than normal, I guess, I answered, rolling down my window to flick the ashes from my smoke out. I shot a glance at the analog clock on the dashboard. 2:45 it read. I let out a small sigh. Great. Vanessa is likely worrying up a storm about us right now. Me, especially. Ever since we'd started dating 5 years ago, my girlfriend had always been rather apprehensive about my habit of taking long, late-night drives when I couldn't sleep. She always feared I'd get into an accident, either with another car, wrap my Honda around a tree, or hit an animal. Most of the time, I'd come home to find her sitting up waiting for me, worry clearly etched into her beautiful sapphire eyes. I bit my lips slightly. Hey, you think I should text Vanessa and let her know we're okay? I asked Craig. I heard him let out a snort. Honestly, bro, number I know the woman loves you to death, and I'm happy she cares so much, but she's got to learn you know what you're doing. Plus, you two need your space. It's not healthy how much time you two spend together. I flicked the remnants of the cigarette out the window and let out a snort of my own. It's called being in love, dude. You should try it sometime, I joked, causing him to let out a laugh. Nah, thanks. I enjoy being single too much. Shaking my head, I stared out the windshield as the headlights guided our way. I felt a slight sense of unease creep up on me as I watched the two-lane road stretch out before us, the moon in the sky almost completely blocked by the trees over our heads. I hadn't seen another car on the road for 2 hours at least. Well, what did you expect, Derek? You drove into the boonies. There's only ghost towns out here. Why don't you try driving all the way to Idaho next time? Shaking my thoughts away, I fumbled in the center console for a moment before pulling out a mixtape. A bit of music would help me feel better. I pushed it into the car's cassette player and hit play. A moment later, the pounding bass and synths of Dance with the Dead's That House began blasting from the speakers. Craig let out a whoop of excitement. Dude, yes! That's the kind of tunes we need for a drive like this. He rolled down the passenger window, sticking his head out the window to whoop and holler into the night. I shook my head, unable to keep from grinning at his antics. Friggin' goofball. The playful mood helped settle my mind, and I felt myself relax into the seat, the tension flowing out of my body and out the window. For a few minutes, that's how things went. The road stretching out ahead of us and then disappearing into the blackness behind us, the music blasting out from the radio, and the soft roar of the engine in the background. I shot another look at the backlit clock. Now it read 5 minutes to 3. We should be at the highway in a minute. The thought released the last wisps of tension in my body and fumbled into the back seat for the bag, catching it with the tips of my fingers. I pulled my bottle of soda from it and, holding the bottle to the steering wheel, cracked the cap. I lifted it to my lips and took a swig, taking my eyes off the road for a split second to tilt my head back. I looked back at the road and nearly spit it all out onto the windshield. In the second I'd stopped looking, a figure had stepped out onto the road. I shouted, jamming my feet on the brake and clutched as hard as I could. The rear wheels of the car locked up, and the ear-piercing sound of squealing tires filled the cabin. To my horror, the tail end of the car began sliding out. Oh hell, no, 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 no! For a few seconds, the world around us became a blur of shapes and colors, and I feared at any moment we'd smash into a tree or begin rolling. Thankfully, the car finally came to a stop with a screech of protest from the suspension. We were facing back the way we'd come. I could tell from the black lines on the road, which had once been the rubber of my tires. I gripped the steering wheel with almost a death grip, my heart furiously pounding in my chest. My breaths came in short, ragged gasps. There was no movement in the car for a few seconds before Craig reached forward and snapped the music off. "Dude, what?" he shouted at me, his face looking as pale as mine must be. I didn't say a word to him. Instead, I pulled up on the handbrake, ripped off my seatbelt, and practically kicked the door open. Stepping out onto the pavement, I stepped to the front of the car on unsteady legs until I was squarely in between the headlight beams. I looked around, first at the road ahead, then at the forest on either side. There was nothing there. What the? I turned and looked behind me, over the roof of the car. The red glow of the taillights illuminated a few feet ahead, but beyond that, nothing but blackness. I turned again, looking out at the darkness beyond the branches. No movement disturbed the bushes and branches, and aside from the quiet hum of the car's engine, it was silent. I shook my head. Did I just imagine things? I shook it again. No, I know for a fact I didn't hallucinate. There was someone there. The sound of the car door opening made me turn, seeing Craig step out of the car. Leaving the door open, he immediately came over to me. "You have exactly 20 seconds to explain to me what the hell just happened before I lose it, bro," he exclaimed. For a second, I fought to find my voice. Then I answered, Dude, I'm not crazy. Someone stepped out of the woods and onto the road. It looked like a chick. I thought I was gonna freaking hit her." I realized I'd been holding in a breath and let it out, trying desperately to get myself to relax. Craig gave me a confused look. "You serious, man?" I nodded. He pulled the flashlight he'd used to look at the map from his pocket and flicked it on, aiming it first at the tree line on one side of the road, then the other. After doing this a few times, he turned back to me. "Well, whoever it was, they're not there anymore." His brow furrowed. "But why would a chick be out here in the middle of nowhere?" he muttered, more to himself than me. I still answered, "I don't know, man. It's freaking Josephine County. For as many good people live out here, there's also a bunch of weirdos." I heard my friend let out a snort of laughter in reply, but something had caught my attention. A feeling which had slammed into me with all the weight of a Peterbilt. The feeling of eyes boring into the back of my skull. I spun around, looking back towards the car and seeing nothing there. But the feeling remained, and I didn't like it one bit. Especially when the feeling came again, this time from the direction I'd just been facing a moment ago. Realization dawned on me, and I felt a shiver shoot up my spine, along with the flicker of fear. "Oh, no," I whispered. Craig turned to look at me. "What?" he asked, seeing the look on my face. He repeated, "What?" I looked up at him, speaking with a bit of a weak voice. "Let's get back in the car, right now." He didn't argue, thankfully. He was already moving for the open passenger door, and I matched his pace as the feeling of being watched intensified, as if someone were rapidly approaching from the woods. Oh, hell. I broke, first into a run, then a full-out sprint for the last 10 feet, tearing at the door handle and practically launching myself into the driver's seat. Slamming the door closed behind me, I jammed down on the door lock, seeing Craig do the same. He turned to me, his face hidden in the dark, but his voice giving a perfect mental image of it. "What the hell was that, man?" The tone of it gave away the fact he'd felt, even for the briefest of moments, the same feeling of dread and fear I'd had. "You remember those videos of people driving on empty roads in the middle of the night, only to have someone step into the road and get them to stop?" I asked. A sharp intake of breath came from the passenger seat before he answered, finishing my thought. "And then a bunch of people spring out of the woods trying to ambush them." "Oh, no. My thoughts exactly. Time to friggin' leave." I released the parking brake, pulling on my seatbelt and jamming the car into first gear. The tires chirped as I hit the gas, and a moment later, we were accelerating away. As we did, the feeling of being watched rapidly fell away to nothing, and I allowed myself to let out a relieved sigh. We drove in silence for another few minutes before I finally spoke again. "I think we're in the clear, man." Craig let out a soft laugh. I nodded, then reached for the soda which had fallen, wedging itself by the parking brake. Snatching it up, I uncapped it and took another swig, the still cool liquid feeling amazing going down my throat. Recapping and dropping it behind me into the back seat, I let a laugh of my own. "I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer, Craig, but I think after this, I may take a bit of a break from late-night drives for a bit. This just got under my skin too much." For a few moments, longer than I thought, there was nothing, and then he answered. "As much as that sucks, bro, I can understand. No problem at all." I thought I could detect a small tone of sadness in his voice, along with something else I couldn't place, but then I heard him sit up straight. "Hey, Jake?" he asked, a bit of a concerned tone now etched into it. "Yeah?" I heard him draw another breath. Shouldn't we be to the highway by now? Or at least see the lights of passing cars?" I hadn't been fully concentrating on anything except the next stretch of road in my headlights, but at his words I jerked my head to look beyond them. What the actual hell? He was right. The lights of cars and trucks flashing by on the freeway should be visible through the dark. I clearly remembered looking in my side view mirror as we turned onto the road from the highway, seeing the ever-present white and red glow zipping by both ways at close to the same distance we were now. That wasn't the case anymore. All I could see in front of us was darkness. Darkness and the woods on either side of the road. For a moment, I lifted my foot off the accelerator, letting the car slow down a little as my brain whirred. He's got to be mistaken. Hell, I've got to be mistaken. We just haven't gotten close enough to the highway yet. You know these old roads, Derek. They often end up longer than they first look. Feeling somewhat relieved by the thought, I said it out loud to Craig. He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. And, for that matter, as much as I repeated it mentally to myself, I couldn't completely convince myself either. It was as if seeing the woman step in the road had shaken me more than I'd first thought. Pushing back down on the gas, I shifted into fourth gear and watched the speedometer flirt with 55 miles an hour. For a few minutes more, neither one of us saw anything as we drove in silence. And then Craig let out a cry. "There! A light!" For a moment, a surge of hope welled up inside me, and I craned over the steering wheel, looking to see the highway. It was dashed as I saw it was only a streetlight, standing solitary guard on the side of the road like a sentry. Beneath it stood an old worn sign which seemed to have been shot at many times with both BB pellets and actual bullets. I slowed the car some as it came towards us so I could read it, and felt a wave of confusion fall over me. Golden, 2 miles. "Oh, no," Craig breathed out as he read the sign. It passed by us, the streetlight momentarily bathing the interior of the car in light and showing the confused, worried look on his face. How did we end up by Golden? Golden is a ghost town, one which attracts visitors every year to check out the standing buildings. It was a mining town which had a population of a few hundred people. But once the prospects dried up in the early to mid-20th century, it became the ghost town it is today. Its biggest claim to fame nowadays was being featured on Ghost Adventures a few years back. Craig repeated his question, but I wasn't able to answer him. My thoughts were racing inside my head. There's no freaking way. Golden is miles to the north of Placer. There are no roads connecting the two areas, from what I saw on the map. Not to mention, we've been driving in a straight line since leaving the gas station. "I honestly don't know, man," I finally answered, my voice conveying how rattled I truly was. In the car's dark interior, I saw him put his head in his hands. I fumbled for my pack of cigarettes, pulling another out with slightly unsteady fingers and pushing in the cigarette lighter. A moment later, the turnoff for the ghost town flashed by on the right. I saw the dark, hulking shape of the church's spire rising out of the dark for a moment. Then it was behind us. The lighter popped out, and I pressed it to the smoke, lighting it and putting it back. I decided I needed to try and calm the rising tension that was filling the car's interior. Look, however we ended up here, man, the fact is, we can't be far now from the highway. So let's just keep our wits about us. Keep calm, and when we get back to my place, you, me, and Vanessa can have a good laugh over this. Sound good? I heard my friend take a deep breath, then let it out in a whoosh. Okay, yeah, that sounds like a plan. He let out a soft laugh, and I felt him pat my shoulder. Thanks, Derek. You are seriously a good friend. Glad I've got you. I nodded, then realized he may not be able to see it in the dark. No problem, man, I said. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed since I'd last looked at it, and yet it felt more like it had been 30. Time seems different when you're stressed. For a few minutes, there was only darkness, and then a light appeared in the distance. Ha! There we go, I exclaimed. I waited to see the sign for the on-ramp appear and felt a shiver shoot up my spine as the sign for Golden flew by again. That's... what? Craig didn't say anything, but I felt him stiffen in the passenger seat, showing he'd seen it as well. As the streetlight and sign disappeared behind us, a feeling began to creep up on me. Another shiver shot up my spine as I realized that it was the same feeling I'd had when we'd gotten out of the car. The feeling of eyes on me. My eyes shifted to the blur of trees on either side of the car, but I saw no one out there. The turnoff for the ghost town approached again. I heard Craig let out another deep breath. Derek, pull over, please, he said simply. His voice was shaking, and as much as I didn't want to stop, I did as he asked, pulling over just before the turnoff. He ripped his seatbelt off, shoving the door open and stepping out. I watched him stride to the front of the car and stand there for a minute. He seemed to start shaking a bit, and I realized just how much this was getting to him. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle when I glanced at the clock and froze. The clock was still showing 3 a.m. The hands hadn't moved at all. A feeling of shock washed over me like a wave as I tapped it with my fingers to see if it was merely stuck. But it refused to begin moving again. Okay, what the actual is going on? I whispered to myself. I reached into my pocket, fishing out my phone and turning on the screen. Like the clock, it too showed the time as 3 a.m. The feeling of being watched began to intensify, and I glanced at Craig standing in the dark before looking down, beginning to type a text out to Vanessa. Hey, baby girl, just wanted to let you know that Craig and I are okay. We're trying to get back to the highway, but have gotten a bit turned around out here. Do me a favor, and if I don't text you again in 15 minutes, text me back, okay? I love you. I replaced the phone in my pocket. I knew I should have been more honest, but I was beginning to feel a little freaked out about the weird situation. I didn't want to worry her any more than necessary, as it would make me start to freak out worse. Pushing open the door, I got out and walked around, stopping near the front right headlight. Dude, you all right? I asked him after a moment. He didn't answer, but happily he seemed to have stopped shaking. I repeated my question. When he didn't answer my second and third calls, I began to feel a new sensation creep up on me, a potent mixture of dread and fear. Craig, dude, you're creeping me the fuck out. Please say something. He finally turned to look at me, and in the semi-glow of the headlights, I saw his face had gone a bit pale. He raised a finger and pointed, saying only a single word. Look. My eyes followed where he had gestured, and I began to feel like someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. The cigarette dangling from my lips fell from my mouth to the ground. Standing about 50 feet away, just inside the tree line, was a figure. It was drenched in gloom, but with a gasp, I realized it was the same woman who'd nearly caused me to wreck. Oh no, sideways, man. I swallowed, finding my voice. We should get back in the car, Craig. He nodded almost immediately. I think you might be right, he answered, his voice wavering. Not taking our eyes off the figure, we slowly backed up until we reached our respective doors and climbed in. I didn't even bother pulling my seatbelt on. I just jammed the gear shifter into first and floored it. Dirt and gravel kicked out behind us, and the car shot forward onto the road. This time, I didn't let up on the gas. I kept my foot hard down, the engine beginning to roar as I shifted into third and fourth. The speedometer reached 60 as I shifted into fifth gear, the feeling of being watched intensifying with each passing second. I prayed that I would see something, anything ahead of us, an intersection, a house, a freaking out-of-use payphone. And then my blood turned to ice as a light appeared ahead of us, the exact same one as before, with the sign underneath. My eyes flickered to the clock, and terror shot through me as I saw it still was frozen at the same time. "This isn't good, bro," Craig said from the passenger seat. I agreed with him, but didn't say it out loud. I kept my foot to the floor, the speedometer now hitting 80. The turnoff appeared again, and what I saw made me want to scream. The woman had gotten closer to the road, and she wasn't alone anymore. Behind her, I saw others, the outlines of other people, dozens, possibly more. They all stood facing the road, watching us fly by, and then they disappeared into the rearview mirror. I breathed out as the light and sign flashed by yet again. This time, the mass of people had gotten even closer to the road. The woman stood in front of them all, and for a split second, the headlights illuminated her. Another flash of ice shot through my veins as I saw the river of blood pouring down the front of her nightgown, one that looked to be decades old. "What the hell do we do?" Craig asked me, his voice steady, yet filled with fear, the same I felt. I just shook my head. "I don't know, man," was all I could say. The streetlight began to appear again when I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket, causing me to nearly slam on the brakes in surprise. I fumbled in my pocket for it, seeing Craig look over at me. I texted Vanessa when we stopped, told her to reply back in a few minutes. Now I think I'm going to tell her to call the cops or something. He didn't reply, instead turning to look out the windshield at the approaching light. Flicking my eyes from the phone screen to the road and back, I forced myself to not look at the turnoff as we zoomed past the light. I didn't want to see how close those ghosts, demons, whatever they were, had gotten to the road. I flipped my finger, pushing away the lock screen and tapping on the messenger icon as the light began to appear once more. Vanessa's message automatically opened, and for a moment, relief like I'd never felt surged through me at the small bit of normalcy I had in my grasp. I froze. I didn't even look up at the road. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the single sentence, reading and rereading it. A wave of confusion passed over me. Enough, I spoke aloud. Craig spoke up. "What? What did she say?" I didn't answer him. My mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, trying to understand. But it was like I was hitting a mental wall. I tried to think of something else as another thought came to me. But again, the same block was coming to me. As it did, a new wave of fear began to rise up in me. One for an entirely new reason, then the terrifying loop flying by outside. The speedometer now showed we were doing 90. And then Craig spoke. "Can I ask you a question, man?" Ice filled every vein in my body. Not at his question, but at his voice. It was different. Gone was the fear and tension he'd had not even a minute ago. Now he just sounded flat. No, not flat. I couldn't tell why, but the way his tone was, it almost made me feel like he was smiling. Another shiver cascaded up my spine as I finally forced myself to answer, my mouth dry as cotton. "What?" he answered as we began to fly under the streetlight. "Are you scared?" For whatever reason, the question made me turn to look at him, just as the light whizzed over us. For a split second, the car's interior became illuminated again. My eyes locked with his. The light flew by. The turnoff appeared again, and for a moment, my eyes flicked up to see that the woman was right next to the road, bathed completely in the headlights. I finally caught a glimpse of her face, and then I was screaming, my fingers tearing at the door handle as the car swerved to the right. I saw a tree flying towards the windshield. I didn't think. I just forced the door open and leapt out. The ground rapidly flew up to meet me. Darkness. I woke up in a hospital room, a bandage covering my head and one arm in a sling. My chest felt like it was on fire as well. The first thing I saw was Vanessa, who upon seeing me wake up, burst into tears and wrapped her arm around me. A few moments later, the doctor came in. He told me that I was a lucky man. Apparently, I'd gotten away with only a gash in my head requiring staples, severely bruised ribs, and a broken arm. Shocking for having dove out of a car at what appeared to be tremendous speed, he said, raising an eyebrow. Then he told me the police wanted to speak to me. He showed them in and 2 officers entered, asking me many questions. I told them exactly what had happened. Well, except for 2 small details anyways. They appeared to take my account seriously and promised to look into it. We've, had some reports similar to yours, sir, one of them answered tentatively. Then they told me how I'd been found. How a father and son who owned a gas station nearby had been out driving and had come across first my destroyed Honda, which had wrapped itself around a tree, and then some, and then, lying unconscious in the grassy ditch, me. They didn't say who they'd been, but I had a fair idea who they'd been. At least the son anyways. That night was 3 months ago. I've been at home, resting and healing this entire time. It's given me plenty of time to think, plenty of time to process everything. I try not to think about that night, about any of it. I feel like I'll go insane if I do, especially after the police told me that they found nobody else at the scene of the wreck. Only the passenger door hanging open. But I've had to, after receiving an email from an unknown address. One claiming to be the son, the kid I saw in the gas station that night. He told me things that his father told him he'd seen for years, that he didn't believe at all, until that night. When he looked out the door at my car, that's when he'd frantically called his father. As I type this out, I feel myself begin to violently shake, remembering the woman's face, indeed a ghost as it flashed in the headlights. The look of horror plastered there as she frantically waved at me to get my attention. The same look the others must have had. Remembering turning to look at Craig as the light flickered over and seeing the smile on his face. A smile wider than any human being's could possibly be, filled with shark-like teeth as black eyes stared hungrily at me. The same shark-like smile the kid told me he'd been flashed as I'd pulled away. But mostly I remember the single line of text Vanessa sent me. What caused me to rack my brain, trying frantically to recall my friendship with the figure sitting opposite me, and horror filling me as I realized I couldn't think of one single memory. What will keep me from ever taking late-night drives again? The 3 words that will remain burned into my memory forever. I shouldn't have gone hiking alone. Hey, this happened a couple days ago, and I'm still processing it. In the moment, I was so sure that I was in incredible danger, but it's barely 48 hours later and I'm already second-guessing myself. But either something incredibly wrong happened on that hike, or I'm going insane, so I'll share my story and let you decide. I suppose I should probably start with some context. I, 24 million, am currently on a solo road trip around the Midwest. I know that seeing the sights in places like Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio probably doesn't sound like the most exciting vacation, but for me it's kind of a big deal. It's the first time I'm traveling for more than a day or 2 away from home, and everyone I know truly on my own. At first I wanted to do something big and exciting, like spending a week in Iceland or joining a tour to Alaska. But it was all just too overwhelming, so I settled for a much tamer vacation. I figured it would be a good first step, and if all went well, I'd have the confidence for a bigger trip next year. And what could possibly go wrong in the Midwest? Well, I have, or at least had, 3 hikes planned for my trip, and the first one was a couple days ago. It also happened to be the longest and most remote of the 3. For anyone who's interested, I decided to do the Red Cedar Trail in Giant City State Park. It's a 12-mile loop that pretty much covers the whole park. According to the internet, it's one of the best hiking trails in Illinois, and it seemed like a good balance for me between challenging but manageable. Now, I've done larger and far more dangerous hikes before this. Admittedly, those were done with other, far more experienced hikers leading the way, but I still knew how to appropriately prepare. I made sure I had plenty of fluids, water and Powerade, some trail mix, bandages, sunscreen, etc. I had a paper map as well as a digital copy on my phone. I let multiple people back home know which trail I was doing, and that I hoped to hike roughly from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. I made sure my parents knew that if they didn't hear from me by 7 p.m. or so, they should contact the park to let them know I might be lost or injured. I did everything right, but no amount of preparation would have helped with this. The first thing that went wrong was the weather. I woke up at about 7 a.m. to gray skies and the sound of steady rain. It wasn't a storm, but it was certainly more than a drizzle. I tried not to lose hope and checked the forecast, but saw that the rain wouldn't stop until the late afternoon at the earliest. I don't really mind being out in the rain too much as long as I'm prepared for it, but I knew it would make the trails muddy and the rocks slick. Still, I decided I had come all this way for the sake of this hike, and I would at least try it. I figured if it really was terrible, I could always turn back early. So I threw on my rain jacket and drove to the trailhead. To get to the trail, I drove past several individual camping sites that people can use. Every other time I've been to a state park, it's been packed. Kids running around yelling about the rules of whatever game they just made up. Families fighting over who forgot to pack the marshmallows. But on this rainy Tuesday at the end of summer, the park seemed pretty much deserted. I think out of the dozens of sites I passed, I saw a grand total of 2 RVs and 1 tent, and none of them had any people out and about. When I pulled into the small parking lot next to the trailhead, I was the only car there. Maybe the lack of people should have made me nervous, but I was honestly excited to have all this nature to myself. For those who care, you can find a map of the Red Cedar Trail online. But basically, the trail really is pretty much a big, very irregular circle. The trailhead is at the easternmost point, and there's a basic campground at the halfway point on the westernmost edge with some fire pits, picnic tables, and outhouses. On a whim, I went south first, going counterclockwise around the trail. As I started down the path between the trees, I immediately realized a few things. First, I was definitely the first one to walk the trail that day, and maybe the first in quite a while. I cleared out about a dozen cobwebs with my face in the first 10 seconds, and they didn't thin out after that. Second, the trail was definitely soggy, but still firm enough to hike. Third, the dense foliage above my head made the falling rain very loud as it fell on the leaves, but also reduced the steady curtain of water to occasional fat droplets that usually missed me completely. And so I walked. The trail was generally pretty obvious. It's hard to miss a line of bare dirt in the middle of thick plant life. There were portions, however, where the trail was so overgrown, I started to doubt it was even a trail at all, and other portions where several trails intersected, and I wasn't sure which was the correct path forward. Luckily, the path was marked by white diamonds with red circles, generally nailed into trees. As long as I saw a white diamond, I knew I was going the right way. Despite spending a lot of brain power between watching my step, looking for diamonds and dodging the cobwebs, I still really enjoyed the first half of the loop. The thick branches above me ensured that the rain was soothing and peaceful rather than irritating and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, the continued lack of literally any other human being allowed for a quiet contemplation unlike anything I've had in months. And so, after 3 hours, I hit the halfway point, a little tired and very wet, but extremely glad I had decided to go through with the hike despite the rain. Then things started to change. The campsite at the halfway point was empty, which I rather expected. I doubted anybody would have camped there the night before, considering how few people were in the main portion of the park. And even if they had, there was a good chance they would have packed up and headed out by then. But somehow the emptiness of the space felt wrong. I really don't know how to describe it, other than it was quiet. I don't just mean I couldn't hear cars or people, or even that there were less animal noises, although all of that was true. I mean, everything just seemed deafened. The rain on the surrounding trees didn't seem to be falling as heavily. The wind that had been rising and falling for hours suddenly seemed to die completely. Even the outhouse doors creaking seemed quieter than it should be. At the time, I just shrugged it off. The rain was dying down, and the hinges must have been oiled recently by a ranger. No big deal, I told myself as I left the clearing to tackle the northern half of the trail. Unlike the southern half, which regularly opens up into wide, flat sections and small clearings, The northern half of the Red Cedar Trail is almost entirely through dense foliage. And when I say dense, I mean I frequently had to duck or turn sideways to make sure the reaching branches didn't snag on my jacket. The trail itself was almost completely covered by foliage at points, and more than once I accidentally wandered off the trail on what seemed like the path of least resistance for a little bit, before realizing I didn't see any white diamonds ahead of me. About a quarter mile into this thicker, darker portion of the woods, I heard a sudden rustling from maybe a dozen feet behind me. Now, I'm no stranger to walking in the woods. I figured it was a small, harmless animal, and when I looked back and didn't see anything, I assumed I must be right. Honestly, even now I still think that particular rustle was probably a squirrel. But the sudden sound made me realize that being alone in the woods miles away from literally any other human may be great for quiet contemplation, but can also make you very vulnerable. At this point, though, all I could do was keep going. I was already past the halfway point. The only way out that made sense was forward. As I continued, I kept hearing sounds that put me more and more on edge. While the rain continued to drum on the leaves overhead, there were more rustlings in nearby bushes and trees. Easy enough to shrug off, but still enough to make you jump. Enough to make you imagine patterns. More than once, some combination of falling water and/or animal movement behind me was enough to convince me that I heard the footsteps of something moving quickly behind me. Of course, nothing was ever there, but I started to get a little paranoid. I didn't think there were any dangerous animals in the park, but maybe I was wrong. I tried not to think about whether it would be worse to have a bear or a person running up from behind, but worse than the rustling leaves or the falling water was a sound that I started hearing maybe about a mile past the halfway point. I can only describe it as a kind of wet cough. Each time I heard a single percussive noise off to the side of the trail, simultaneously breathy and moist. Maybe a deer could make that noise, I thought to myself. Or wait, don't people hunt out here? Oh man, what if there's a guy out there with a gun? Suddenly, I was terrified that some hunter might mistake me for an animal in the dim light and thick leaves. So I called out to make sure there wouldn't be any accidents. Hey, I'm a human! Leave me alone, please! I felt embarrassed almost as soon as I said it, but it still seemed like a good idea. Whether it was animals or humans making the noises around me, they probably knew that I was here. I hadn't exactly been quiet as I hiked my way through the brush. Announcing myself would encourage animals to give me more space and make sure humans wouldn't accidentally shoot me. After my little announcement to the forest, the wet cough stopped and I started to relax. But then a much more disturbing sound started. Every 5 minutes or so, I'd hear what sounded like a little girl's voice. Maybe 10 or so years old. It sounded incredibly human, a lot like my younger sister, but I never heard it long enough or clearly enough to make out any words. I'd hear maybe a vowel sound and the hint of a consonant, and it'd be gone. It was always behind me, always sounding like it was over the hill or a couple turns in the trail back. More than once, I called out again like I did before. Hey, anyone there? I'm a person, please don't mess with me. But I never got a response. I really started to worry, but kept searching for ways to rationalize it. I've heard that people can experience auditory hallucinations when they're isolated from the world for extended periods of time. I didn't think 4 or so hours in the woods counted as extended, but it was better than imagining a ghost child following behind me. Either way, walking forward still seemed like the best and only option. It'd get me away from the creepy sounds and back to my car so I could drive far away and stop freaking myself out. Honestly, at this point, a part of me was laughing at myself. I knew that all of this was just me overthinking and scaring myself, and that I was just imagining things. I tried to keep calm by thinking about other things. I thought about what I'd get for dinner once I was done. I thought about the D&D campaign I'm supposed to run this weekend. I thought about how much my feet were starting to hurt. Anything but how creeped out I was. And honestly, it worked. For a little bit at least. For maybe a mile or so, I managed to lose myself in my thoughts and just walk without noticing or caring overly much about what did or didn't happen around me. Until suddenly a loud echoing thud forced my attention back to my current situation. It seemed like it came from just on the other side of the hill I was currently walking alongside, and happened exactly once before the woods went silent again, other than the rain falling above. My brain raced trying to figure out what it could have been. It wasn't a gunshot, I'm sure of it. It was much heavier and duller, if that makes sense. It almost sounded like the trunk of a car slamming shut, but far louder and heavier than any trunk I've ever heard. Maybe a tree falling? Honestly, I still don't know what that sound was, but it doesn't really matter. What matters is that when that thud broke my train of thought is when I finally realized that I hadn't seen a white diamond in at least half an hour. I tried not to panic. I've been following this trail the entire time. There's no way I'm lost. But is it really the trail, or is it just a trail? Is it a trail at all? Have I just been following a stream for an entire mile? It has been extra muddy lately. I stood there and thought for a long time about what to do, and eventually decided I had to follow this trail I'd been following backwards until I found a white diamond again. Otherwise, who knew how long I might be wandering in these woods? But as I turned around to head back, I slipped on a wet rock protruding from the ground and fell forward. I managed to catch myself well enough that I had no major injuries, but that's not why this fall was such a big deal. I can't have been on the ground for more than a second or two, but before I could get back up, I heard that same damn wet cough, but this time it was only a couple of inches above my head. I'm not ashamed to admit I screamed as loud as I could, kicking and thrashing about, trying to hit whatever had coughed in my ear, but I only managed to punch a nearby tree and bruise my hand. I was on my feet no more than 3 seconds after the cough, wildly turning in circles, searching in every direction for whatever had made that noise. But nothing was there, just me, the woods, and the rain. As my heartbeat gradually slowed, I realized something that made my heart sink far more than all the sounds I'd been hearing. I was still on the trail I had been following, if it even was a trail, but between my fall and my wild spins to catch some sign of whatever might be tormenting me, I had completely lost track of which direction I'd come from. I didn't have a compass with me, and between the thick clouds above me and the fact that it was near noon, I had no way to judge west from east, let alone north and south. I pulled out my phone to try to call for help. Even if there was nothing out here with me, I was lost in the woods, and that's a good enough reason to call 911. But it was dead. It didn't make any sense. It had been at 78% when I pulled it out to check the time at the halfway point, but now it wouldn't turn on. I considered just staying where I was and waiting for someone to find me. Surely I wasn't that far off the main trails, but waiting meant staying here in the woods by myself for hours, if not longer. Hours spent cold, wet, afraid, and alone. Or even worse, maybe not alone. In the end, I knew I couldn't just stay here, so I picked a direction and started walking along I've been home for about a day now, and I'm trying not to worry too much. I mean, I live in a pretty big city, and it's not like I gave that woman my address or anything. I'm hoping that this is all nothing. Maybe this lady really was just a nice old woman trying to make a friend, and I was overreacting. Maybe the note on my car was meant for someone else. It's not like there were disembodied children's voices and phantom footsteps like my last hike. Everything could have a personally reasonable explanation. I'll definitely keep triple checking the locks on my doors and windows though. Edit. So I know I just posted this a little bit ago, but on a hunch I did some research on the St. Louis Canyon that the old lady recommended. It turns out that back in 1963, women were found dead in the canyon. A guy was arrested and found guilty, but he spent his entire life claiming that he was framed and that he's innocent. I don't want to make light of these deaths or anything, but with everything that's been happening to me, I really don't like the fact that this creepy old woman tried to send me to the location of a relatively infamous triple homicide. Assuming you've read that post, you know how terrifying my solo hike a few days ago was. You'll also know that despite that experience, I was planning to go ahead with another solo hike this last Friday. I got a lot of advice, but the main thing everyone seemed to agree on was that I should be careful, and that if the trail was as deserted as last time, I shouldn't go. And I agreed with all of you. I figured I'd be very careful to listen to any gut feelings I had. If anything felt even a little bit off, I'd get out immediately. I did all the same careful preparation as the first time, and even a little more. I packed up food and water, told multiple people where I was hiking, and made sure to have a paper and digital copy of the map. I also packed a small knife, a compass, a flashlight, a panic whistle, and a battery pack so I could recharge my phone if it died again. I did some research and made sure that there were no dangerous predators in the area, and even did a brief search to double-check that there were no major reports of cryptids or paranormal experiences in the area. I felt I was ready for anything, and that even if I had a repeat experience, I'd be prepared. I prayed was the trail. I wanted to run, but I didn't. I knew trying to run through the mud and wet rocks would just make me fall, and maybe this time I'd break something. So I kept my pace slow and steady. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I had already called out to anyone who could hear me more than once, and got no reply. Doing so again would be a waste of breath at best, and at worst might anger whoever or whatever was out here with me. So I stayed quiet. I wanted to look behind me, but I didn't. Not when I heard rustling footsteps, not when I heard wet coughs, not when I heard fragments of a little girl's voice from just a little ways back. I knew I wouldn't see anything, or I wouldn't like what I did see. So I didn't turn around. For over an hour, I walked with no sign that this would ever end. Every turn of the path I followed just led to more thick woods. Every step felt harder than the last. Every sound behind me sounded closer than the one before. Every minute that passed made me more and more sure I wouldn't be able to make it out of these woods. And then suddenly I was looking at a white diamond with a red circle just a few feet ahead of me, and there was another one up ahead. The rain had died down to almost a complete stop. The wet coughs that had been happening every few seconds almost right behind my head ceased. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me and saw nothing but an empty trail. I didn't wait for things to go wrong again. I picked up my pace as much as I safely could and made sure to follow the diamonds carefully. I didn't walk more than 5 steps in any given direction unless I could see a marker up ahead. Gradually, the trees were spread further and further apart, and the foliage surrounding me thinned until suddenly I was back at the trailhead. I've never been happier to see an empty parking lot. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, and I laughed out loud as I started to make my way towards the car, when I heard the last and worst sound of the entire hike from behind me. I'm a human. It was my voice. It was my fucking voice, and it had come from the woods behind me. Either I was truly going insane, or someone or something in those woods was trying to scare me, toying with me. So I ran. I forgot that my legs were on fire. I forgot that my feet felt like I'd just finished a 30-hour shift of standing behind a register. I didn't worry about the mud or the mess I was bringing with me. I sprinted to my car, dove in, and drove off as fast as I could. In my rear-view mirror, I saw a figure emerge from the trailhead. I didn't see it long enough to make out any detail, but I know one thing for sure. It was far too tall to be a 10-year-old girl. I really don't know what to think. I don't really believe in monsters or ghosts, but I don't know how to explain what I experienced. Maybe some asshole that's really good at imitations and throwing his voice spent hours just trying to mess with me. It's hard to believe, but honestly, it's probably the most likely explanation. At least, I want it to be. I skipped the hike I was supposed to do yesterday for obvious reasons, but I'm supposed to do another one tomorrow. It's in a different park hundreds of miles away from the Red Cedar Trail, and nothing weird has happened since I drove away from that figure 2 days ago. So I'm thinking I might go for it. I don't want to give up on hiking and camping for my entire life because of what may or may not have happened to me. And this trail is shorter and more popular. There will almost definitely be more people around this time. It'll be fine, I hope. I had stopped to take pictures at a few of the viewpoints. She greeted me warmly like an old friend. "Oh, it's you! I was just trying to get a picture of this dragonfly, but it flew away." I didn't see a dragonfly or a camera, but I assumed she must have just put her phone in her pocket. Ready for LaSalle? I was a little disappointed to realize that she intended to hike the last stretch with me. She certainly seemed nice enough, and it's not like I was worried she'd attack me or anything. She was just a little more talkative than I might have liked. But I nodded, and together we crossed the stone bridge that led to the canyon trail. Initially, I tried picking up the pace enough to just naturally leave her behind, but she kept up without an issue. She kept up a steady stream of conversation. Are you from around here? Where are you from? What do you do for work? On and on she went with the kind of surface-level questions you ask when you're first getting to know somebody. I'd answer the questions, and trying to be nice, I'd occasionally ask her about herself. Oh, I live right around here. I actually came here for the first time 60-some years ago. Oops, showing my age a little, she chuckled. My work keeps me pretty active, so I'm lucky to still be able to spend time in the woods. Lately, I've been trying out other forests, though. As I listened to her voice behind me, I rounded one last corner and found myself staring at what would have been the waterfall in LaSalle Canyon. But, like the other would-be falls in the park, this one was dried up. The trail ended here, and I walked right up to where a few droplets of water still fell from where the falls used to be. I realized the woman was still talking behind me. Have you ever been to the Red Cedar Trail? I froze. It had to be a coincidence, right? I mean, the internet did say it was a popular trail, although my trip didn't really seem to support that theory. Still, surely she couldn't have known that I had just hiked the Red Cedar Trail a few days ago, and she certainly couldn't have known how bad of an experience it was. I came up with all of these explanations for myself in less than a second, but my danger sense had gone from 0 to 100 in the blink of an eye. I slowly turned to see the old woman smiling at me, and for the first time, her smile didn't seem warm and friendly. It seemed cruel. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but could only have been a few seconds before I heard the snapping of a branch from back the way we'd came. The woman's head snapped back around, and we both saw the group of 3 middle-aged guys walk in, chatting about some sports game. I might have imagined it, but I swear the old woman growled before smiling and saying, "I'll get out of your way in case you want to take pictures." It really is a pain when there's too many people in this canyon. And she walked away. I just kind of stood there for a while, waiting to calm down. When the trio of hikers were done taking their pictures and turned to go, I made sure to follow pretty close behind. I stayed near their group all the way back to the parking lot, close enough that they'd definitely hear if I called out. The 2-mile walk gave me plenty of time to think about what had actually happened in the last hour or so, and I realized a few things that made me worried. First, with the exception of the moment when the 3 guys walked into the canyon, every moment I'd spent with the woman we'd been completely alone. With the sheer amount of people I'd seen on the trail, it felt like there was no way that could have been a coincidence. Second, I realized just how much this woman had seemed to want me to go to the most remote point in this set of trails. She had recommended it repeatedly, given me directions to it, and even walked the final stretch with me. And finally, I realized just how much I'd told this strange woman about myself. I'd told her my name and how old I was. I told her what state and even what city I was from. I told her what I did for work, and meanwhile, I hadn't even gotten her name, let alone any solid details about who she was. Everything she'd said about herself was vague at best. All I knew for sure was that she liked being in the woods. Luckily, the return trip was pretty uneventful. As I walked across the parking lot to my car, I tried to shake off the bad feelings and told myself I should focus on the first half of the hike. I'd had a good time and gotten lots of great pictures to share with family and friends when I got home. Then I saw the sheet of paper folded up and tucked under one of my windshield wipers. I pulled it out hoping it wasn't some kind of parking ticket, but it was a map from the visitor center. Someone had circled LaSalle Canyon and drawn a couple of arrows in what looked like black Sharpie, and on the other side was a short note. It read, "Thanks for the fun, see you soon." But my hike from a couple days ago was almost the polar opposite of my first one. Instead of a gray, rainy day, the weather was beautiful and sunny. When I got to Starved Rock State Park, rather than a quiet, deserted forest, I found a busy, popular tourist destination. The parking lot for the visitor center, which doubled as my trailhead, was packed with cars, and I saw over a dozen people start or finish their hikes just in the time it took me to park my car and gather up my stuff. Instead of overgrown with dense foliage, the trails were wide and allowed visibility for hundreds of feet in any direction. Instead of a lonely 12-mile loop, I was only hiking 4.5 miles, and I only ever went a couple minutes at a time without seeing someone heading in one direction or another. Everything seemed perfect. It wasn't until the hike was over that I realized how wrong I was. Within the first 15 minutes, I had relaxed almost completely. I found myself nearly laughing out loud with the relief of knowing this hike would be better. The birds were singing, the mosquitoes were buzzing, and the views were fantastic. The hike I did took me past several canyons, which is incredible for Illinois, and it seemed every other bend of the trail led to some awesome photo op. It was at the first of these awesome views that I met the woman. As I rounded the corner of the trail to find myself at the entrance to French Canyon, she was just standing there, staring across the dried-up stream bed towards the canyon wall. At the time, I didn't think too much of it. It was a pretty cool view, and I considered stopping myself to take a picture or two. But as I began to step towards her, she instantly turned towards me and smiled. "Oh, am I in your way? Feel free to pass me. I'll stay out of your way." She was an older woman. I'd have guessed maybe in her 60s, although she was clearly very healthy and athletic. She was wearing a black t-shirt, jeans, and hiking boots, and had long gray hair tied back in a ponytail. I didn't look too closely at the shirt, but I thought I saw it was for some event in Chicago, which made sense enough. Her smile was friendly, and her greeting felt just like any number of brief exchanges I've had with fellow hikers in the past. "Oh, no worries," I replied. After all, the trail was plenty wide for me to pass her without issue. "It really is a great view. Maybe I'll stop and take a picture too," I laughed, pulling out my phone. "Oh, it really is," she agreed. "Have you been here before?" "I've been here more times than I can count. You should really come back in the winter. It's so beautiful then, very quiet and peaceful. Too many people here this time of year." I smiled politely back and told her that no, this was my first time. I thanked her for the advice and continued down the path into the mouth of the canyon. It quickly led to a dead end, and I realized that the main trail must go up and around the side of the canyon. But I didn't mind the little detour. Having the huge rock walls towering above me on all sides made for an awesome spot to stop for a quick drink of water. I stood enjoying the silence for a moment before turning around to double back and found the same woman standing right there. "It's a shame the waterfall is dried up. You should really make sure you go to LaSalle Canyon. That waterfall is almost definitely still flowing," she said, seemingly oblivious to the fact that she had sneaked up behind me. I had already been planning to go to LaSalle. In fact, it was the main destination of my hike, and I told her so. She, in response, pulled out a map of the park that I recognized from the visitor center and started giving me directions. At this point, I decided that this was just a nice, friendly old lady who really loved nature and struggled a bit with picking up on the social cues of someone who'd prefer to be left alone. But I didn't want to be rude, so I let her walk me through the hike I'd already planned on doing before thanking her and turning to go. As I began to walk out of the canyon, she called after me. "If you have time, you should really go to the St. Louis Canyon too. It's fantastic." I knew I didn't have the time, but I nodded and said I'd see if I could fit it in. After I left the woman at the bottom of the dead waterfall, the next mile or so passed uneventfully. I took the shortest path towards LaSalle Canyon and passed about 9 overlooks, 3 or 4 trail intersections, and at least 50 other hikers. Eventually, I got to the last trail intersection before the LaSalle Canyon, and the same woman from before was standing there again. I was more than a little confused. How did she pass me? I was moving pretty quick, and I knew I took the shortest path from French Canyon to where I was now. She definitely didn't pass me along the way either. I eventually decided she must have taken one of the longer paths and managed to just barely beat me to the intersection because there are no doors on my new house. When I heard that there are homes in Michigan that you can buy for $3,000, I knew I had to have one. What I found were homes that had been stripped to bare shells and homes with trees growing out of their tops. That's why when I found a place on a decent drive in relatively okay condition, I was thrilled that all the house was missing were the doors. The 4-bedroom, 3-bath house was amazing compared to what I had seen. Running water, working electrical, nice hardwood floors, no mold, no rot. Someone must have taken all the doors very recently, even the front and back ones, and nothing else. Not even the copper handles and taps. I waited for the real estate agency to send someone out for the official show. I was expecting someone in a real estate-owned, graphic-wrapped car and a friendly smile. What I got was the world's most filthy van, driven by the world's sketchiest, skeeziest, and skitziest driver creaking to a stop right in front of me. A woman rushed up from within and pushed her face against the glass of the van's side windows. It was hard to hear her, but I think she said, over there all the time. And they said they lost a man, and Johnny never lost a man because Johnny went to war and brought men back. But they looked, and they lost that man. They looked up and down, and they couldn't find him, and they knew he was there. But he wasn't because he put doors up. Same as Sam, she went into one. And I tried to dismiss this crazy lady with a small wave. All right, thank you, ma'am. Have a nice day. Doors! Johnny went into the back room to talk to Lori, who went through the kitchen to get to the room. Both lost, and Johnny never lost anyone. The doors! The driver seemed to panic and took off with a screech as a new real estate-owned graphic-wrapped car pulled to a stop with the paperwork and deed to the house. I didn't let one old burnout's bad trip story scare me. The area was cheap enough for me to rent a room in for a bit, while I arranged for a contractor to come and put the doors on. All of the well-established and more reputable firms in the area wouldn't even stay on the phone as soon as I said my address. One was kind enough to laugh and stay on long enough to ask, "You must be from outstate hearing about one of those cheap houses, eh?" That's where those kids went missing a while back. Well, 20-year-olds. Everyone sees him go into one of the rooms. Nobody sees them leave. Some folks been trying to move in there for at least the past decade, but most leave not long after. Seen the police there a few times. If I were you, I would unload it to the next sucker and get out. It's cheap for a reason. But that man knew I didn't have it in me to just walk away based on rumors. I hired a group outside of the state to install 16 doors at a premium, including pantry, closet, and pull doors to the attic. They estimated 2 weeks, the universal standard for all remolding jobs. I got a call from the on-site super brand 2 days later to tell me he and his crew are pulling out and issuing a credit without legitimate reason. They sounded spooked and only said they refused to go into the back room without legitimate reason. I raced back to the house hoping to catch them still there to ask what was going on. I was happy to see their work truck still here, but the men were not in the house. I decided to check the back room to see what was wrong with it. The back room was the only one near the back door, a strange offshoot that had its own bathroom, a washer and dryer, and 2 couches crowded with old rag dolls that the former owners left. The men hadn't installed any doors except for the front and back doors, and ones on the back room. The only thing out of place in the back room, other than the creepy rag dolls, was Brand's cell phone, still open with only 4% life left. Enough for me to see it had tried to make 350 calls in 2 hours. They recorded 15 minutes of videos broken up into 2 to 3 minute segments. I watched the longest of the videos first. It was shaky hand camera video that showed my backroom door opening to my hallway, but a little different. The wall lights were in the wrong spot. Bran opened and shut the backroom door again to show a completely different room, the upstairs bathroom, before coming to the hallway again. Someone asked something in Spanish and the cameraman answered, "Yeah, the rooms are different each time we shut the door. I'm just getting the video of this craziest thing ever." They walked to the front door, and cameraman told a worker to abra la puerta, and one of them opened the door. The video showed the front door opening to the back room. They laughed, shut the front door, and opened it again. It was still the back room. Bran returned to the back room and opened that door, and saw that it now opened to the guest bedroom. Their laughs were weakened with fear. The video bobbed wildly as they ran to the back door and opened it to find the front room. One of the workers yelled "Ventanas," and the cameraman looked up at the windows. They no longer showed the outside, but other portions of the house. They were breathing hard, nearly hyperventilating now. They ran through the front door and into a kitchen and through the den, all in a line when they shouldn't have been. They finally arrived to the back room, but all of the rag dolls were gone from the couch. The men off-screen gasped, and the cameraman murmured, "Oh my God." As the camera was about to point at what they were looking at, the phone died. I looked up from the black screen to see the door to the back room slowly shut on its own. My fingers were able to slip in just in time before the door closed. I swear I could feel the house trying to force the door closed, but I forced more. The front door was also closing on its own. By design of malicious intent, I can't say, but it was closing fast. I swear I saw a corner of my own bedroom starting to form outside before my foot kicked the door outward to the real world. Now there are no doors on my house. Story 2. My first night in alone in my new house didn't go so well. We just built our house, Will and I. Last month we were able to move in. It's small, not even 1,000 square feet. His parents call it a micro home. I call it perfect. It's just us and our 2 dogs. Well, 3 now, but I'll talk about that in a minute. First, I should explain a few things so this story makes more sense. I've lived most of my life here in Colorado. I was born and raised in Denver. I took a hiatus when I went to college out of state, but I came back. It's home. Our new house is just east of the Front Range and south of Denver. We're pretty far out of the city. It takes 30 minutes or so to reach the city limits of Denver. Our nearest and pretty much only neighbor, Steve, is just over half a mile away, which isn't really all that far. I can see his house from here as I type this. He's also my best friend and has been since high school. It's really an awesome setup for Will and I, and we love it. But last night didn't go so well. Will is out of town for work for 4 days, leaving me and the dogs alone in the new place for the first time. It didn't occur to me to be bothered by this, since I've spent plenty of nights alone before. The day was as normal as could be. I drove Will to the airport without any trouble, came home, took the dogs for a stroll around the property, got some work done. I talked to Will on Skype for a while, made dinner and retired to the deck out back afterwards. I was sitting in a chair, enjoying the cool air, minding my own business. Down the road a bit, I could see the lights on in Steve's house. Not a thing seemed to be out of the ordinary. I was so enjoying the night air that I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, took in the smells and sounds of nature around me, and that's when one of the dogs growled. The sound made me sit up so fast I almost fell out of my chair. I studied the 3 dogs and figured out pretty quickly that it was Big Ben who had made the noise. Ears alert, he was staring off into the night with keen eyes. The 2 girls were equally alert, although they didn't seem to have heard or seen what he had. The look to him while he continued to gaze toward the dark yard. He gave another low, almost inaudible growl. Now there's certain sounds that dogs make that really put you on alert. This was one of them. It was an unsure, almost hesitant growl. Like something was spooking him, but he didn't know exactly what. I followed his gaze, but nothing within the confines of the fenced-in backyard seemed amiss. Unless there was an animal just beyond the wooden fence, as far as I could tell, there was nothing at all for him to be growling about. I watched him for a minute, and he kept looking in the same place. He'd sniff the air, and his ears would swivel, as though something just beyond his ability to sense was out there. I started to feel a little creeped out, but the other 2 dogs, Danny and Nina, didn't seem to be picking up on anything. I studied him for a few more minutes and finally convinced myself he was either overreacting about something or imagining things. So Big Ben is our newest addition. He showed up a few weeks before the house was finished, just out of the blue one day, while I was checking on the progress of things. He's a massive, shaggy black bear of a dog. Although he appeared to be a stray, he had come right up to me, tail wagging, and greeted me as though he'd been my dog all his life. Who could turn him away? We took him in immediately. The vet we took him to found no microchip and no one around had heard of a missing dog, so we kept him. Will was the one who named him, and a fitting name it is. He's 100 pounds and his shoulder almost comes up to my hip. I'm convinced he's got wolf in him. He's been like an oversized puppy from day one. Never aggressive and as obedient and loyal as our girls. But at times I have some trouble figuring him out. Sometimes he does weird things. Growls at nothing. Stops dead in his tracks like he hears something. Or stares into the distance like he thinks he sees something. At the end of the day, we have no idea what his life was like before us. It was possible was on his own for months. The vet thinks he's about 3. His heightened sense of awareness could just be from being on his own for so long, having to look out for himself. Nonetheless, I felt a distinct shift in the atmosphere as a result of him growling into the darkness. I was genuinely uneasy, and for the first time since Will had left, was fully appreciating the fact that aside from my trio of dogs, I was alone. My eyes involuntarily drifted towards Steve's house. The light from within gave me a sense of comfort. Knowing I could pick up the phone and have him at the door in minutes calmed me down some. But I wasn't about to bother him over this. I was going to head back in for the night when I looked towards the black shadow of the mountains. And then I heard it. It was a very faint, almost indiscernible sound coming from the woods. A pattering sound, like something walking on the forest floor. It was so faint that I wasn't even sure if I was hearing it or my ears were playing tricks on me. It could have been the light breeze rustling the leaves. And then a light wind came up. And I swear the moment it did, I heard what sounded like someone saying, "Shh." That freaked me out, but when I strained to listen, it was hard to distinguish the sounds of the wind in the leaves from anything else. I thought I imagined it. The dark was making me freak myself out. The sound of faint footfalls continued. It went on for a few minutes before it was so faint I couldn't tell if it was wind or not. I shrugged it off. There's deer back there, and stray cats, and probably other animals I never even see. There was no reason to worry about it, but it still sufficiently creeped me out. So I went back inside. I watched Netflix, yay Peaky Blinders, for a bit, but got sleepy. By 11 I was in bed, and it didn't take long for me to fall asleep. But I didn't stay asleep. Every night a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Series looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. 2 girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule, only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. "Hey," she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. "Did you just move in?" I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. "Yeah, about 5 seconds ago." "Cool." The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk, and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. "Grandma," I explained, feeling strangely defensive. "Cute," she replied, holding it up to her face. "Has anyone told you yet?" the other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. "Jesus, Gianna, give her a second." "Well, she needs to know." "Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name." I blinked at the 2 strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. "My name's Arden," I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. "Did they tell you?" "Tell me what?" "Oh, of course they didn't. The rules." I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. "Where did you move here from?" I ignored her. "What rules?" Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. "Something happens here every night," she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. "Something weird." "Like what?" I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. "Someone walks down the street," Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. "That one, right down there." She pointed at my window. "It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them." I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. It happens at a different time every night, the other one said softly. We never know when it's coming. Why? She shrugged almost sadly. We don't know why. I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. I don't believe you, the girl shrugged. You don't have to. You'll see for yourself. The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, or too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. We'll come back later, Gianna said matter-of-factly. We'll show you. Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist, and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name? Story 3. Every night a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Series looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule. Only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. Hey, she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. Did you just move in? I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. Yeah, about 5 seconds ago. Cool. The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk, and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. Grandma, I explained, feeling strangely defensive. Cute, she replied, holding it up to her face. Has anyone told you yet? The other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. Jesus, Gianna, give her a second. Well, she needs to know. Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name. I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. My name's Arden, I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. Did they tell you? Tell me what? Oh, of course they didn't. The rules. I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. Where did you move here from? I ignored her. What rules? Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. Something happens here every night, she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. Something weird. Like what? I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. Someone walks down the street, Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. That one, right down there. She pointed at my window. It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them. I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. It happens at a different time every night, the other one said softly. We never know when it's coming. Why? She shrugged almost sadly. We don't know why. I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. I don't believe you, the girl shrugged. You don't have to. You'll see for yourself. The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. We'll come back later, Gianna said matter-of-factly. We'll show you. Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist, and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name? Every night a different person walks down the street and screams for help. We aren't allowed to help them. Series looking back, I feel dumb. Completely stupid, actually. I should have known that apartment was far too cheap to be right, even for a studio. I should have known there had to be a catch. The day I moved in was a complete blur. I insisted that no one help me, not wanting to prove any of my family members' suspicions about my character. By late afternoon, all my muscles ached terribly and my head throbbed. I fell back on my bare mattress, staring up at the ceiling fan with glazed over eyes. I pulled the damp strands of hair from my sweaty forehead, wincing in disgust. Someone knocked on my door, causing me to jump. I cursed under my breath, pushing myself up on my elbows. Two girls were peeking around my doorframe. Foolishly, I had left it wide open, forgetting the old college rule. Only leave your door open if you want to make new friends. And I was not in the mood to make new friends. One of them, an Asian girl with choppy black hair, was grinning at me. The other stood a little further back, fingering a box of Marlboro Reds. Hey, she said, nodding at me. Her voice was smooth and raspy at the same time. Did you just move in? I laid back down, rubbing my face with both hands, choosing not to bother with manners. Yeah, about 5 seconds ago. Cool. The girls walked in, evidently ignoring my very clear body language. The girl with the black hair ran her fingers along the edge of my desk, and then picked up a little ceramic duck from my unpacked box of trinkets. Grandma, I explained, feeling strangely defensive. Cute, she replied, holding it up to her face. Has anyone told you yet? The other girl asked abruptly, looking around my apartment. She had tucked the cigarettes into the back pocket of her jeans and was now tugging at her long red braids. Jesus, Gianna, give her a second. Well, she needs to know. Yeah, but we haven't even asked her name. I blinked at the two strangers incredulously. I hadn't even had time to put toilet paper in my bathroom, and here they were, touching my things and talking about me like I wasn't there. I just wanted to take a nap, honestly. My name's Arden, I said. The girl with the red braids, Gianna, sat down next to me on my bed. Did they tell you? Tell me what? Oh, of course they didn't. The rules. I blinked again, my face blank. I didn't know about any rules besides the typical renting ones. I had signed the lease after, at best, skimming over it. The landlord was a skinny woman who smelled of ashes, and I was fairly certain she had never developed the facial muscles necessary for smiling. I wasn't about to ask her any follow-up questions, especially when the rent was so cheap. The other girl laughed nervously. Where did you move here from? I ignored her. What rules? Gianna got a strange, wicked sort of smile on her face, bouncing a little on my mattress. The other girl sighed loudly. Something happens here every night, she began, pulling out my rickety office chair and sitting down. Something weird. Like what? I sat up, frowning at her. Finally, my interest was piqued. Someone walks down the street, Gianna said, her voice reminding me of a camp counselor telling a scary story around the bonfire. That one, right down there. She pointed at my window. It's someone different each night. They scream for help for about an hour, but we aren't supposed to help them. I just stared at her. I felt a small chill run up my spine. I didn't know what to make of all this. It happens at a different time every night, the other one said softly. We never know when it's coming. Why? She shrugged almost sadly. We don't know why. I scoffed, leaning my elbows against my knees. I don't believe you, the girl shrugged. You don't have to. You'll see for yourself. The look in her eyes made me want to believe her. She seemed sincere, but I couldn't even begin to fathom what they were saying being true. It was too strange, too outlandish. I knew this wouldn't be the nicest neighborhood, but it couldn't be that bad. It had to be a prank. They had to be hazing me or something. We'll come back later, Gianna said matter-of-factly. We'll show you. Before I could protest, she grabbed the other girl by the wrist, and they were gone. I followed them to the door, watching them march down the hall, talking to each other in hushed voices. I closed my door behind them. That night, as promised, they came back. They came dragging along two boys. One was somewhat muscular, wearing a tight black t-shirt and baggy jeans, and my eyes were instantly drawn to a silver heart-shaped locket around his neck. He smiled at me and introduced himself as Will when he walked in. The other boy was smaller but chubbier and nervous-looking, with a buzz cut and ill-fitting cargo shorts. His name? I was told was Mateo. The girl named Gianna came in carrying a bottle of wine and that same slightly crumpled box of cigarettes. The other one, the girl I still didn't know the name of, was the only one who looked even somewhat apologetic. They all sat down on my dusty floor, next to the window, and motioned for me to join them. I sat between Will and the nameless girl, unsure whether I should continue feeling violated or if I should just give in to my strange, pushy neighbors. Do you all live in this building? I asked, hesitantly accepting the wine when it was passed to me. Yeah, Will answered with a grin. It seemed half-hearted. This building is where all the young people live. It's where they put us, Gianna cut in, lighting a cigarette. It didn't even occur to me to tell her not to smoke inside. We've all been sorted out. Forgive her. She's a bit of a conspiracy theorist. It's not a theory, she snapped, glaring at him. Look at the other ones. Next door, the middle-agers. People with kids, but no grandkids. Across the street, old people. Not a single 20-something in that entire building. May, tell him. So her name was May. I looked her over, admiring her smoky eye makeup and how she'd tied her hair up, long strands poking out like exploding fireworks. Stop it, May muttered, reaching for the wine bottle. You'll scare her. I'm not scared. She just shrugged at me, as if she didn't believe me. We passed the bottle around and then around again. I listened to them bicker and laugh. It was clear they'd all been friends for a while, and I felt a little bit like I was intruding, even though they were in my apartment. Will asked me if I had gone to college, and I told him I did, but I dropped out. They all nodded sympathetically, which made me feel stupid. By midnight, I was a little bit buzzed, and my guard was beginning to fall. I had to admit it felt good to have friends. I had already mentally resigned myself to a life of solitude, at least for a while, but it seemed that might not actually have to be my fate. I laughed at Mateo and Gianna's drunken argument, passing a cigarette back and forth with May, blowing the smoke out of my open window. I had almost completely forgotten why they were all over when it happened. All at once, a blaring alarm came from each of our phones, like an Amber Alert. I could hear the sound echo throughout the neighborhood, like an entire chorus of hundreds of phones going off, not just ours. I nearly leapt out of my skin. Not even Yana laughed. All of them went quiet and they looked at me as I took it out, frowning at the screen. Do not interfere. It's coming, Will whispered. He had changed, his eyes almost glassy and his voice soft and shaky. Mateo squeezed his shoulder. I looked at May. Her eyebrows were cinched together in concern, and she was stubbing out our cigarette against the windowsill, shrinking away. There it was again, that chill. It crept up my back, spreading along my scalp and making me shiver. Something felt deeply, deeply wrong. The others were quiet now, staring silently at the window I was sitting up against. The air felt somehow warmer, like it was buzzing with something, or maybe I was just sweating. We sat there unmoving for what felt like half an hour. Right as I was getting tempted to ask what was going on, I heard it. It was far away and faint, but I still heard it. A cry. It continued as it got gradually closer, louder, more desperate. Help! Please, my God, someone help me! Slowly, I leaned out the window. I had to see it with my eyes, had to confirm there was actually someone out there, like they had said there would be. My new apartment was on the 4th floor, so it was hard to see who was down on the street without squinting. In the flickering streetlights, I could make out the outline of an elderly man. He was hunched over, wandering aimlessly from door to door, wearing only what looked like a hospital gown to cover his pale, broken body. Behind him trailed a path of dripping blood, although I couldn't see where it was coming from. Please, I'm hurt. I looked back at the others, my mouth hanging open. What is this? I demanded loudly. What the hell is this? May touched my arm, trying to calm me down. I pulled away from her. Arden, please. We have to help him. Why can't we help him? He's just an old man. We can't help him. Trust me. I ignored her, leaning further out the window, prepared to call out to him. Before I could open my mouth, I froze. The man down there was still now, facing our building. His head was tilted upwards, and I couldn't see his eyes, but I knew he was looking right at me. I immediately felt cold, like I was plummeting into ice water. Help me, he whimpered into the silent night air, his voice barely audible. Then he began to scream. That scream wasn't human, or at least not any human I had ever met. It was desperate, agonized. It made my stomach turn and my eyes prick with tears. I couldn't look away. The blood was coming from his arms. Or, I should say, his lack of arms. Where his arms should have been, there were only bloody, mangled stumps. They looked fresh. He didn't move other than a shaky sway, and his eyes didn't leave me. His shriek slowly molded into words that I could just barely understand. Please, 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 please. May yanked me backwards, away from the window. I landed on my ass and yelped in pain and horror. What is that thing? I whispered. I didn't mean to whisper, but that was all that came out. We don't know, May replied, her eyes trained on Will, who was crying now. Mateo held on to him like he might topple over. We just know to follow the rules. What happens if you don't follow the rules? I asked, and immediately regretted it. Will sobbed softly. Outside, the old man wailed. Jana reached over and pulled the window shut, but it somehow did nothing to muffle the blood-curdling sound. Do you want to tell her, or should I? Mateo asked Will. Will just shook his head. He was clutching his locket now, turning the little heart over between his fingers. Mateo sighed and turned towards me. A couple of months ago, one of them got to Will's girl. Shannon, Jana butted in. Her name was Shannon. Sorry, her name is Shannon. I swallowed, but whatever I did, nothing would force down the lump in my throat. What happened? Mateo shook his head. We don't know. We were all together when the screaming started. Usually we just ignore it now, you know? No use in dwelling on it. But that night we think she saw something different. She started insisting she had to help, and she ran outside. We couldn't stop her. He paused, glancing over at Will. He was silent and still. The screaming outside had begun to pass, getting softer as it continued further down the street. Then what? He shrugged. Nothing. She was just gone. I pressed my lips together, trying to process all of this. I really had believed they were messing with me, but I had seen it. I had witnessed it firsthand, and it terrified me. Why doesn't anyone leave? He shrugged for a second time. Can't afford it, or people just don't care. Some people have left, but we all signed an NDA with the lease, so nobody ever knows. I frowned, thinking back to signing the paperwork, trying to remember. I could vaguely picture what he was talking about. I had just assumed it was more legal jargon that I would never understand. Had I seriously signed a non-disclosure agreement without even noticing? After that, I told them I wanted to go to bed. I needed time to process all of this. They understood, and each one of them said goodbye before leaving me alone. As I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, for some strange reason, I thought of May's face when we had realized it was happening, how she'd put out the cigarette and backed away from the window. Eventually, I was able to drift off to sleep. The next few weeks were difficult. I spent more and more time with my new neighbors. I came to find that they were right. I didn't think there was a single person older than 30 in our entire building, but I saw them all the time leaving the one next door. Settling in was difficult. The others seemed so used to it. They cared, of course. It scared them, especially Will. But you could tell they had been here a while by the way they sighed, closing the blinds and focusing harder on whatever they were doing. Eventually, I began to mimic them. It helped a little bit to pretend it was normal, as strange as that sounds. Moving out wasn't really an option for me anyways. I was a college dropout, and I hadn't found a job yet. I was still just getting by on what I had managed to save up. Every night, it was someone different. Some were more human, some seemed less. Some were drenched in blood, their clothes ripped and strange, but some looked fairly normal. The worst were the children. They would run like injured chickens, screeching and banging on doors, begging for help. Sometimes they would try different things, say different things, like they're coming, like I don't want to die, or even I'm sorry. There were a lot of children. One night, while I was half awake, an alarm went off. It wasn't like the one on our phones, it was blaring, only somewhat muffled by my window. My apartment glowed a flashing red from outside. I didn't even look. I was too scared of what I might see. I just covered my head with my pillow and tried to fall back asleep. I came to learn all of the theories, especially from Gianna. She thought we had all been chosen and predetermined to live here, all for some sick little government game. She thought maybe there were people betting on the different buildings, putting down money on who would interfere the least. See that? She said to me one day in the hallway, returning from a coffee run. Cameras everywhere. I didn't know if I believed her. I spent time with May mostly. We smoked on the front steps and people watched. It was strange to see what at night was such a sinister and gruesome neighborhood during the day, bright and lively. She didn't talk much about the rules, so I didn't either. We didn't talk all that much in general, I found, just enjoying each other's company. Right when I was beginning to feel comfortable was when it happened. It started with a birthday cake. Happy birthday! As May walked through the door, Mateo blew into his plastic party horn. The paper inflated, smacking Will on the side of the head. May's hand flew to her heart. You know I hate surprises. Gianna laughed and walked over to her. In her hands, she held a chocolate cake, haphazardly adorned with sprinkles and bright pink icing that read, Happy Birthday, May, in the center. 24. She set down the cake on the dresser and threw her arm around May's neck. How does it feel? That's the spirit. Enough of this, Mateo cut in, weaving between them. Let's eat some cake, then let's go. Their tradition, I had learned, was to bar hop for birthdays. They told me there was no curfew here, despite the rules, just a recommended time to be home, which was 10:30 p.m. Usually, they said, they got home before the alarm or spent the night somewhere else. We all took some cake. The boys took shots in the kitchen to pre-game, while I watched Gianna fuss over May's hair. I was never much of a partier. While at clubs or bars in college, I spent most of the time out back, chatting with the smokers. But then again, I was never much of a friend group person either, so maybe the circumstances were changing. I watched them all troop outside to Mateo's car. I stuffed myself in the back, incredibly conscious of how close I was pressed into May. My other shoulder rammed into the car door. Mateo's music, cranked up to maximum volume, hurt my ears, and the tiny space was packed with the smell of tobacco and various perfumes as we sped down the freeway toward the city. But it was nice. It was really nice. I found myself laughing with them, and I hooked my arm around May's when she weaseled her hand beneath my elbow. It was actually nice. As predicted, the bars they chose weren't exactly my scene. But this time, as opposed to college, I could stand it. I took shots. I followed them out for smoke breaks. I even danced under the low purple lights until my feet ached inside my chunky heels, surely riddled with blisters. By the time we got to our third bar, I couldn't even feel it anymore. And it was at that third bar that we crammed ourselves into an old photo booth, and Gianna reluctantly offered $5 to the slot, and we laughed, red-faced, into a tiny camera. After the photos spit out into the compartment, the others slid through the red curtains, but before I could follow, May grabbed my wrist. She held me back, sliding her long, baby blue nails up my wrist. I shivered. "You never gave me a birthday present," she whispered, and I could feel her breath on my face. If I was wearing my glasses, they would have been fogging up. "Yeah, well, I didn't get to finish my quip before she kissed me. It was nice. And then it wasn't." "Hey," Will called out to me, squeezing through a crowd of men wearing tattered leather jackets to get to me. "Arden, where's everybody else?" I blinked, looking around. I could have sworn they had been right there a second ago, but now none of them were anywhere to be found. I shrugged. "Dunno. Why? What's up?" He finally broke free from the swaying mass, and I got a better look at him. He looked worried. His face was flushed, and I could see a few drops of sweat creeping out from his hairline. He took his phone out of his pocket and held it out to me. First, I saw his home screen. It was him next to a girl with strawberry blonde hair, both clutching beer bottles and grinning widely at the camera. Then I looked where he actually wanted me to. The time, 1:47 a.m. "It's getting late," he narrated. "Can we find the others and get going?" I understood then. He was worried. It was past 1 a.m. and no alarm yet. It was later than usual. The bars would start closing soon. He wanted to get back before it happened. Will and I weaved through the crowd. I was pretty buzzed, and I realized I was having a hard time moving my feet right, which made me feel embarrassed. I hadn't even had that much to drink. Was I that much of a lightweight? We found them outside, chain smoking. Will explained the situation while I swayed. The drive back was strangely tense. Mateo's music was turned down, and there wasn't any joking or boisterous gossiping like there had been on the way out. We all felt it. It didn't need to be said. Something was off. Will drove fast, almost reckless. In the dark, May took my hand. Just as he was careening around the last corner, and we could almost make out the shape of our apartment building down the street, it happened. All of our phones went off at once. Jana let out a small shriek from the other side of the back seat. "Do not interfere." Mateo turned back towards us, pressing his finger to his lips. Had this ever happened before? By their reactions, I didn't think so. It was different when it came when I was in my bedroom, when I could just shut the curtains and put my headphones on. I felt so small and helpless then, like I was gazing into the maw of something incomprehensibly beyond my understanding. I felt like we were all flies, and this neighborhood right now was the spider's web. Will drove slowly now, maybe 5 miles an hour. We were all still. We were all silent. Not even a stray breath cut through the quiet. Underneath the glowing streetlights, I could make out the side of Will's face. He was pale, and if I hadn't seen his knee shifting as he pressed down on the brakes, I could have mistaken him for a mannequin. The car came to a stop. I followed his gaze, all the way down the street to the dark horizon, and I saw what he saw, a silhouette. It was far too distant to make out what shape it took, but it was evidently humanoid. It moved in a shaky stumble, limping down the middle of the road in our direction, and in the overwhelming silence I could hear it, far away but still deeply urgent. "Help me! Will!" Jana hissed. "Turn the car around." Will didn't move. He just stared forward, as white as paper. It didn't make any logical sense, but I knew what he knew. It was too late now. There was no use. "Help me! Please help!" I could tell now that it was a girl from its voice and its figure as it got closer. It was wearing some sort of white nightgown, not unlike the old man's hospital attire from that first night, stained with dark red blood. From here, I couldn't tell if it was fresh or dry. I didn't know why that mattered to me. "Maybe," May whispered. Her arms shook against mine. "Maybe if we're quiet and we duck down, it won't see us." Deep down, it felt as hopeless as turning around had felt, but it seemed reasonable. I nodded and did as she suggested, crouching behind the passenger seat, my knees throbbing from the strange angle I'd bent myself into. We all did it, except for Will. He didn't move. He still just looked. When he finally spoke, I could barely hear him. It was so weak. "Shannon!" The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mateo was the one to break the silence. "What?" "Shannon," he repeated, finally turning to look at his friend. "That's Shannon." I peered over the seat in front of me, squinting my eyes. The human-like thing was getting closer, And now I could make out strawberry blonde hair, round face, short legs, the girl from Will's phone lock screen, the girl who had disappeared. Shannon. May gasped next to me. Dude, Mateo said slowly, his words crumbling as soon as they left his mouth. I know what you're thinking, dude. Do not get out of this car. Will didn't even seem like he was with us anymore. He was in shock, I think, looking back. I have to help her, he insisted, right as another sickening cry rang out. Help me! Help! Help me, please! Someone, it hurts! It was getting far too close to us for comfort, but it still didn't seem to notice the car. Its cries became more and more desperate as they got louder. I have to help her, Will repeated, and a bit of life had returned to his face. Mateo shook his head and grabbed at his sleeve. Will, that is not Shannon. Will glared at him, his eyes shining with tears. I know Shannon. That's her. I know you do, dude, and I know you miss her. But please, please don't do this. Their voices were getting louder and more distraught, and I felt May press into my side, trembling like a leaf. Gianna was whimpering, but I couldn't see her from my position. The thing was almost to our car when it stopped. She turned her head, left, then right, almost like she was sniffing the air. The boys stopped arguing. I felt like my heart would burst out of my chest. I could see Shannon's face now, and I realized why she hadn't seen us. The girl's face was streaked with gore, and it looked like her eyes had been scooped out with a melon spoon. She cried, drool pouring from her slackened mouth, but no tears could come. It happened too quickly. None of us could stop him. Will violently ripped his arm away from Mateo, fumbling for the handle to the car door. Gianna screamed. Mateo tried to slam down on the lock, but he missed, and Will managed to get the door open before he could try again. He stumbled onto the asphalt and hit the ground with a soft crunch. The thing turned her head and began to scream. But instead of charging at Will, she backed away. She held her arms out in front of her like something might attack her, whipping her head around wildly. An alarm went off like the one I had heard that one night, but far more unbearable now that I was in it. The streetlights lining either side of the street switched to a flashing red, and Mateo threw himself into the driver's seat, the tires screeching as he peeled away. Gianna was screaming at him, pleading with him to go back. May was weeping into her hands. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I didn't understand. As we sped away, I looked back. I couldn't help it. I saw the flash of some sort of van in the blinding red light, pulling around the corner. Then nothing. That was a week or two ago. I don't know, I've been having a hard time keeping track of time. None of us have spoken much since that night. We tried the police, of course, but as you could assume, nothing came of it. I think whatever this is far larger than we know. I don't know if it's some kind of experiment or just a sick game, but I'm going to move back into my parents' house next week, despite all their berating, and then figure out what to do from there. I don't know if that was really Shannon that we saw that night, or if it was something else, and I don't know which is worse. All I know is that last night I heard Will's voice outside my window, crying, pleading for help. I'm a realtor. Something is very wrong with the house I was showing today. Everything was clean, the AC was set to a comfortable temperature, I had finger foods out, chill music playing, and a candle going. I was still new and this was one of my first solo events, but I felt like I was ready. The house was cute. It was 1 story, 3 beds, 2 baths, a perfect starter home. It needed some updating, but it was nothing too crazy that the average DIYer couldn't handle. I was surprised at the time that the family had wanted to sell it all. They had only lived here for a short time. They had tried to distance themselves from the process as much as possible. They'd even refused to set foot in the home since they left. I was feeling good and had an hour to spare before the open house started and people started streaming in. To pass the time and calm my nerves, I decided to wander through the house as another last-minute refresher for any questions I'd get on the house itself. I walked around the kitchen, living room, stairs. Wait. I stopped so abruptly that I nearly tripped myself. This house was 1 story. There was no second floor visible from the outside, and these stairs were not here any of the times I'd been to this house. I was sure of it. The staircase looked like it fit with the house, and since staircases don't appear out of nowhere, I thought maybe I was so nervous that I was just losing my damn mind. I decided to check my paperwork to make sure I wasn't getting it mixed up with a different house I'd been to recently. It did confirm that this was a one-story. Maybe it was just an attic or crawl space, and I'd missed it before. There was a small landing with just a door at the top. I figured it'd be good to check it out in case I got questions about it. As I stepped through the door, it was like stepping back in time. I also felt pressure in my ears as if I were on an airplane making a landing. The upstairs had a musty smell to it. There was a small extra kitchen, another living room, a bathroom, a bedroom, and a locked room with a glass door, but a full-length curtain on the inside of the door obscured the interior from my view. I stopped to take it in, and the curtain seemed to flutter slightly, as if there was a slight breeze or something moving behind it. The bedroom had wallpaper consisting of ornate patterns and velvet flowers. I had never seen anything like it. This place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but there was no dust or other signs of age-related wear. A sudden sound from around the corner made me jump. I followed the source. A radio had suddenly started playing in the living room. It made a sound as if it were in between stations. There was a soft lime green sofa and a TV that looked older than I was. Yeah, this place definitely was straight out of the 70s. The thing is, the house itself was built in the 90s. There was another odd curtained room off the living room, too. It looked identical to the first, but this door was open, just a crack. I couldn't describe why, but it made me nervous. I suddenly noticed that despite it being only 6 p.m. in July, it was pitch black outside the windows up here. Something about this floor, besides it appearing out of nowhere, gave me a really weird feeling, despite the cheery colors. It felt like a thin veneer painted over something much, much darker. I decided I'd spent enough time up here and found myself thinking, I hope the upstairs disappears again by the time the guests arrive, which was a sentence I never imagined I'd find myself uttering. I rounded the corner back into the tiny kitchen, but it was different. Cabinets were open that had been closed, but worse, the door to the stairs was just gone. This top floor couldn't have been more than 1,000 square feet. There was no way I had just got lost. I decided to retrace my steps. Maybe I hadn't come in through the kitchen after all. I went back down the hall to the bedroom and bathroom. The curtained room was gone. I felt a raw, I know this doesn't make sense, but I don't know what to do about it, sort of panic. I leaned into the bedroom with the fuzzy wallpaper and noticed the curtained room was in the bedroom now, but the door was open more. I could hear some faint sound coming from behind it, and I knew that I didn't want to stick around for when that door opened all the way. I walked quickly back and stuck my head into the living room. The curtained room was gone, and the door to the stairs I had taken up here had yet to reappear. A new door had appeared, though, at the back of the kitchen. I debated and decided to open it. To my immense relief, there were stairs, but the more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't right. It was dark at the bottom, so dark that part of the stairs blended into and then disappeared into a blackness as velvety as the old wallpaper. These stairs also looked old, much, much older than the rest of the house appeared to be. Before I realized what I was doing, I had already walked down several steps. I had an inexplicable urge to continue downward. Something was down there that I needed. It was old, ancient maybe. It needed me too. I was here, and it had waited so long. It felt good to be needed. It felt right, descending into the darkness. Its elation was infectious. It vibrated through the air. No, elation isn't the right word. It was the yearning of something hollow, dangerous, looking to be full. It was needful. I was terrified. I knew something horrible was down there, and I kept continuing towards it against my will. In my mind, fear and self-preservation were fighting a losing battle against whatever it was down there that had its hooks in me, pulling me towards it. The air was electric with its excitement. My foot began to disappear into that horrid, beautiful, foreboding darkness. In the distance, a door opened and closed, shattering the silence. Someone was calling out. I blinked. It was a light in the darkness. The open house. In that moment, the connection between the thing in the darkness and myself was broken. I took advantage of the distraction and ran back up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. Someone was downstairs looking for me. I ran through the kitchenette, and the door to the stairs were back, the real stairs. I could have cried in relief but didn't dare blink or let anything obscure my vision, lest it disappeared again. The curtain door had also moved again, so that it was right next to the door to the stairs. The door opened toward the back hall so that I could look inside from where I was standing. It was halfway open this time. My instincts told me, do not look in there. Don't. Look. I reached for the handle of the door to downstairs. A soft crying was coming from the curtained room. It was alien, unlike anything I had heard before. It was not a mournful sound. Don't look. My hand tightened on the handle, and I heard the cry become louder, closer to the entrance of the partially open door. It was coming. I opened, spun around, and closed the door and darted down the stairs. I looked over my shoulder, but nothing had followed me. Someone had shown up early, and I must have made a terrible first impression as I came flying down the stairs, sweaty, eyes wide with terror. I tried to get myself together and think of some way to explain my terrible state, but before I could even figure out what to say, he gestured to my ears. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I gingerly touched first one and then the other, and sure enough, a small trickle of blood was leaking from each one. I hadn't even noticed it, but it had been dripping down, staining the collar of my blazer. I managed to collect myself a bit before the rest of the potential buyers came filing in and let my hair down to hide the bloodstains. The rest of the night was a blur, honestly. I was on edge, ready to leave and lock myself in my apartment and sleep with all of the lights on. I was never going in a dark room again. I could barely focus. I hoped more than I'd ever hoped for anything before, that no one would go up the stairs or make me go up there again. The stairs were still there, but not a single guest approached them, asked me about them, or even looked at them. They walked around them like there was an invisible obstacle there. For a while, as I nodded and answered questions robotically, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. Was I losing my grip on reality? The only thing that confirmed to me that I hadn't had some sort of waking nightmare was when the first guest stopped me on his way out. He told me to take care, that it was going to be okay, and I almost hugged him. I think he saved my life by giving me some sort of anchor to reality. He took one last look at me and then very clearly stared up at the door at the top of the stairs for quite a while. That was one of the weirdest and scariest things I've experienced, but that's not even the worst part. When I got back home, I noticed something in the hallway of my apartment, a door that had never been there before, made of glass with a curtain obscuring the view from the inside. It was only open a crack, but it was enough for me to hear that sound, like a failed attempt at mimicking a crying child, echoing down the empty. Story 4. I took a night shift security job, but something isn't adding up. A few weeks ago, I started working as a night shift security guard for an old office building downtown. The place is mostly empty at night, just a few cleaning staff and the occasional late working executive. The job seemed easy. Check the cameras, do an hourly patrol of the building, and make sure everything stays locked up. At first, the hardest part was staying awake. I'd sip coffee at my desk and glance at the cameras, which usually showed nothing but empty hallways. The building was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice every little sound. It was on my third night when I saw something strange. Around 3 a.m., the motion sensor in the west stairwell went off. The camera feed showed nothing, just an empty staircase. I figured it was a glitch. Sensors in older buildings can be finicky, but when I went to check it out, I found the stairwell door open. I was sure I'd locked it earlier during my rounds. I shrugged it off and locked the door again. Maybe one of the cleaning staff had used it and forgotten to close it. But when I asked the cleaners about it, they swore they hadn't gone near that stairwell. The following night, it happened again. Same time, same stairwell. This time, I didn't bother checking it out. I just locked the door remotely and made a note in my report. On my fifth night, things got weirder. I was reviewing the camera footage from earlier in the evening when I noticed something odd. At 2:47 a.m., the west stairwell camera showed the door slowly creaking open. No one was there. The hallway was empty, but as the door swung wide, the lights in the stairwell flickered just once. I rewound the footage and watched it again, and that's when I noticed it. Just before the lights flickered, a shadow passed across the bottom of the stairs. It was quick, like someone had darted just out of view of the camera. That was the first time I felt uneasy. The next night, I decided to do my rounds early, hoping to get ahead of whatever was going on. I started with the west stairwell, checking every door and corner. Everything was locked, exactly as it should be. But when I got to the bottom of the stairs, I noticed something on the wall. Scratches. Long, deep marks running down the paint, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across it. I reported the scratches to my supervisor the next morning, but he just laughed. "It's an old building," he said. "These things happen." Last night was my breaking point. Around 3:15 a.m., I heard a noise, not through the cameras but with my own ears, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on a door. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, coming from the direction of the west stairwell. I hesitated, my heart racing, then grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise. When I reached the stairwell, the tapping stopped. The door was open again, swinging gently on its hinges. The air in the stairwell was freezing, much colder than the rest of the building. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight down the stairs. That's when I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost inaudible, coming from the bottom of the stairs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I froze, listening, and then the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I turned and left the stairwell, locking the door behind me. I didn't finish my rounds that night. Instead, I sat at the security desk, staring at the monitors, waiting for my shift to end. I called out sick today. I'm not sure if I'm going back. Truck driver encounters unexplainable horror on remote night road. It was a night like any other on the desolate highways that crisscrossed through the heart of nowhere. My name's Jake, and I'm a truck driver. Been hauling cargo through the lonesome roads for over a decade. The kind of life that keeps you company with the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt. That night, I found myself on a particularly eerie stretch of road, swallowed by an impenetrable fog, the kind that wraps around you like a suffocating shroud, concealing the world beyond. The only companions were the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the mist and the rhythmic beat of raindrops on the roof of my rig. I'd heard rumors on the CB radio about this stretch, a place where truckers whispered of abandoned cars, tales of drivers gone missing without a trace. It was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned drivers, but I'd always scoffed at such stories. That is until that night. As I maneuvered through the winding road, the fog became denser, almost palpable. Visibility dropped to a few feet ahead, and the low hum of the engine seemed swallowed by an oppressive silence. The glow of my headlights refracted off the mist, casting eerie shadows that danced like wraiths in the night. It was then that I saw him, a silhouette on the side of the road, a man, or so it seemed, standing motionless in the fog. My instincts told me to keep going, but the human in me wanted to lend a helping hand. I eased off the gas and the truck rolled to a stop beside him. He was oddly pale, and the fog clung to his form like a ghostly cloak. But what sent a shiver down my spine were his eyes, big, round, and as black as the void itself. His mouth, a gaping maw, stretched wide in a manner that defied the laws of anatomy. I hesitated, a chill crawling up my spine. Something was terribly wrong. The man-creature didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. He just stood there, staring into the fog. With a lump in my throat, I decided to get going. But as I revved up the engine, I glanced back at him. That's when I saw it, the twisted, grotesque smile that curled on his featureless face. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, leaving the fog-draped figure behind. As I drove away, I grabbed the radio mic to share my unsettling encounter with fellow truckers. But to my dismay, the once buzzing airwaves were silent. No static, no voices, just an unsettling void that mirrored the fog outside. The road seemed endless, and I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring in protest. I needed distance from that creature, needed the safety of the city lights. But as the miles blurred together, the fog persisted, unyielding. I drove way over 100 miles and was sure that creature was far away and I will never met it again. In the distance, a lonely parking lot emerged, and I decided it was time to pull over. The weariness and fear clawed at me, and I desperately needed a moment to collect myself. I shut off the engine, closed the curtains, and tried to shake off the encounter as mere imagination. Little did I know that the night had only just begun, and the horrors lurking in the fog were far from done with me. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind. I locked the doors, closed the curtains, and nestled into my bunk, hoping that the haunting image of that pale figure with the unnaturally large eyes and twisted smile would fade away with the night. But sleep remained elusive. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, a sense of impending doom washed over me, jolting me awake. A shiver ran down my spine as I fumbled to open the curtains. The parking lot was bathed in an eerie glow from the flickering overhead lamps, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the fog. That's when I saw them again. 3 of those nightmarish creatures. They stood like sentinels, their dark eyes fixed on the truck. Panic gripped me as I fumbled to turn on the cabin lights, revealing their ghastly features in all their horrifying glory. Their mouths wide open emitted guttural growls that reverberated through the metal walls of the truck. The air in the cabin grew thick with an otherworldly presence, a malevolence that seeped through every pore of my being. I reached for the ignition, praying that the truck would roar to life and carry me far away from this nightmare. But nothing happened. The engine remained silent, as if in protest against the encroaching terror. The creatures, sensing my vulnerability, began to advance. Their movements were unsettlingly smooth, almost as if they were gliding across the asphalt. The growls intensified, echoing through the desolate parking lot. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back as desperation set in. My hands trembled as I repeatedly turned the key, willing the engine to respond. The growls escalated into a cacophony, and the creatures closed in, their features contorted in a grotesque display of hunger. Just as the creatures were about to reach the truck, a surge of relief washed over me as the engine roared to life. I slammed the gear into drive, the truck jolting forward, leaving the creatures behind in the rearview mirror. As the truck sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were not bound by the laws of the physical world. Their terrifying growls echoed in the distance, even as the city lights finally emerged on the horizon. I dared a glance back, and to my horror, I saw the creatures running after the truck with unnatural speed, far beyond anything human. It was as if the shadows themselves were chasing me. As I drove into the welcoming glow of city lights, the creatures abruptly halted. Their twisted forms lingered at the edge of the urban sprawl, their growls fading into the night. Relief mingled with a lingering dread as I realized they had a boundary, a limit to their reach. I parked the truck in a well-lit area, surrounded by the comforting hum of civilization. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio mic once more, hoping to connect with someone, anyone, but the static-filled airwaves remained stubbornly silent. The city lights seemed to push back the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were still out there, waiting in the shadows for their next opportunity to strike. The night was far from over, and the road ahead held more horrors than I could fathom. I spent the restless hours of the night parked in that well-lit haven, the city lights warding off the encroaching darkness. But no matter how brightly the urban landscape glowed, the images of those nightmarish creatures lingered in the recesses of my mind, their growls echoing like a sinister melody. As dawn began to break, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. I pulled back onto the road, my eyes scanning every shadow, every patch of fog, with a newfound paranoia. The city lights gradually faded in the rearview mirror as the road stretched into another desolate expanse. My radio crackled to life, the sudden sound making me jump. It was a voice, a fellow trucker. "Hey, you there? You okay?" The voice sounded concerned, and I eagerly responded, recounting the horrors of the night, the fog-shrouded figures, the broken radio, and the unrelenting pursuit. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice spoke, heavy with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You're not alone. We've all heard those stories, the abandoned cars, the creatures in the fog, but we always thought they were just stories." The revelation sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one who had faced those monstrous entities. The radio buzzed with hushed conversations among truckers, each sharing their own encounters with the supernatural on this stretch of road. The stories varied, but a common thread emerged. Those creatures, with their haunting eyes and twisted smiles, were a malevolent force that seemed drawn to the lonely roads in the dead of night. No one knew their origin or their purpose, but they left a trail of fear in their wake. As I continued my journey, the unease persisted. The roads seemed to stretch endlessly, and the fog clung to the edges of the highway like a malevolent specter. I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were watching, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. The radio chatter intensified, with truckers exchanging advice on how to avoid the creatures, sharing tales of those who had disappeared without a trace. The fear was palpable, a shared experience that bound us together in the face of the unknown. With each passing mile, the city lights became a distant memory. The road ahead was swallowed by an impenetrable fog, and the radio once again fell silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. As I approached the familiar stretch where I first encountered the creatures, a sense of dread settled over me. The fog thickened, and the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Then a haunting realization struck me. This road was a loop, an unending circuit that brought travelers back to the heart of the supernatural. The city lights, the camaraderie on the radio, all illusions meant to deceive. The creatures weren't bound by distance, they were bound by time, forever haunting those who dared traverse this cursed stretch. A guttural growl echoed through the fog, and the twisted figures emerged once again. Their black eyes bore into my soul, their gaping mouths emitting an otherworldly wail. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring in protest, but the truck seemed tethered to the nightmarish loop. As the creatures closed in, the fog swallowed everything, and the road became an unending void. The last thing I saw were those eyes, an abyss that seemed to consume all light. The radio crackled to life one final time, a chorus of terrified voices screaming a warning. But it was too late. The creatures closed in, and the world descended into darkness. And so, the haunted highway claimed another victim, lost to the eternal night and the malevolent creatures that lurked within the fog. The loop continued, a never-ending cycle of horror, trapping the unwary in an unending nightmare. The road stretched on, shrouded in fog, a haunted path that few dared to traverse, and even fewer escaped. Have you guys heard this new horror podcast, The Final Party? It's called The Final Party. It's really good, and I'm kind of hooked on it. I've always been a big fan of ARGs and fourth wall breaking horror and meta-narrative and stuff, and this podcast's super good for that. I'm usually pretty late to the party with these kinds of things. I only started listening to the No Sleep podcast late last year, for example, so you've probably all already heard it, but I haven't seen anyone talking about it on here, so I thought I'd mention it. I have no professional or financial connection to this podcast. I just want to clarify that. This isn't advertising. I'm just a big fan. I don't work on it. I don't know who does work on it, actually. They don't have any kind of social media presence. No Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. I found a few fan pages, but they don't seem to be official, and nobody knows the details of who's behind the show itself. It surprises me they have so many subscribers. Generally, podcasts seem to need to promote the heck out of themselves on social media. The narrator has a very familiar voice, don't you think? At first, I wondered if he was someone from the horror narration community, but I can't place him. He's got that sort of sultry, vaguely menacing British voice that some of the best male horror narrators can pull off really well. But there's something extra about him, isn't there? Like, I swear this guy wouldn't sound out of place in Hollywood. I wish I knew what his name was. I'd love to listen to more of his work. On the show, he just calls himself the host. I guess that fits, really. The podcast is hard to describe for anyone who hasn't listened to it, which is why I'm reaching out to other fans on here, so maybe we can get a discussion going before tonight, which I'm really excited about. So, basically each episode takes place at a party. At first I thought it was the same party, and I guess in a way it is, the final party, but the location seems to change each episode. A group of friends show up to the party and generally start having a good time. It's always some kind of decadently decorated basement location, from the way they describe it. Plenty of booze on hand, dim lighting, music playing from unseen speakers. And then here's where the really cool part kicks in. After we hear the partygoers shooting the shit with each other for 5 or 10 minutes, the host shows up, He tells them the theme of the party, and it's always something really fucking creepy or horrible. Some of my favorite episodes have been an episode where there's a dead body hidden around the party, and the guests have to find the dismembered body parts and piece together the victim. The big reveal at the end of this one was that the victim was the sister of one of the characters, and they all freaked the fuck out when they found her head inside the disco ball. I love that touch. The episode where the guests are served pizza and forced to eat it on pain of death for all of them, and one of the slices is laced with extremely fast-acting poison, and it's sort of a game of Russian roulette to see who eats the poison pizza. It was a boy called Craig whose girlfriend absolutely freaked when he vomited up his insides. An episode where the guests have to decide amongst themselves which member of the party they're going to drown in a bathtub. This one had a brilliant twist because they finally decide to kill this one guy who they all think is a bit of a dick. But when they do, it turns out the bathtub is filled with acid and the murderers get their arms burned off too. Really clever horror gimmick. The obligatory slasher killer episode where someone is murdering the party guests and it's kill or be killed. The two surviving party members end up stabbing the killer to death only to find out it's their teacher, who's been blackmailed into murdering them all horribly by the host, who has the poor guy's family. And my personal favorite, the episode where the party guests are told they have to cut their own fingers and toes off to fill a bowl attached to a scale that'll trigger a door and release them. This one was really grim because most of the people in this one were total assholes, and they end up turning on this one poor kid they'd been teasing and bullying in the intro and forcibly removing his digits without cutting off any of their own. The denouement here was awesome. They all rushed out the exit when it unlocked, leaving the poor fingerless kid bleeding on the floor in the party room, only the exit led straight down a fucking lift shaft. The sound effect as all five of them just plummeted into the darkness and splatted at the bottom was fucking great. I swear they must have thrown a slab of ham down an actual lift shaft or something to get that sound. So yeah, I know maybe it sounds a bit traditional Saw-like horror, but any of you who've heard it know why it's a bit better than that. Yeah? I mean, first off, the actors are absolutely incredible. Like, I've never heard a podcast acted that believably. It's different actors each episode too. You never get the same partygoers twice. The only person who recurs is the host. And they're just incredible. I don't know if they record in a studio or actually set up the party locations and just roleplay, but you'd swear it was the audio of an Oscar-worthy movie or something. It sort of makes me wish they'd live stream it or do a visual version, actually. I think it'd go down really well on YouTube or something. I guess it's just the budget that'd require. Doing it in podcast form, they don't need any special visual effects for the horrific kills or anything. It makes it seem more real when you can't see it, I guess. Secondly, remember I mentioned meta-narrative fourth wall breaking, yeah? That part's really fucking clever, and it leads to listener engagement in a way that I'm surprised more podcasts don't do. Presumably, the tech's fairly easily accessible if Final Party does it, but I've never heard anything quite like it elsewhere. Basically, and I don't know how it does it, but the podcast draws on your iTunes or podcast feed user data to make custom recordings aimed at you. The host addresses you by name as if he's narrating the podcast directly to you. It's incredible. The way he describes the scenes, the way he tells you what's going on, it's like he's actually there watching it all play out. It's very well written. I think my absolute favorite way the fourth wall was used was one time when I listened to the show with my boyfriend. We normally listen to it alone, then discuss it afterwards. It's creepier that way. But one night he was staying over, and it was new episode day, and we were both super excited to listen. I've no idea how they did it, but the host addressed both of us. We totally flipped. Proper screaming, then looking at each other and laughing. My boyfriend was logged into some of his accounts on my laptop, so I guess it scraped his user data from somewhere, which I guess is probably a security concern, but fuck. It's just too cool and creepy to worry about that too much, right? At the end of every show, you're issued with a custom invite to come party yourself. I love that touch too. Like, I could have actually believed that these parties are for real going on somewhere, and I could actually go to one and get the pants scared off me. Me and my boyfriend talked about this a lot. There's even a community of fanfic writers who write about their own ideal final parties. And I admit I got a bit involved with that. It was through that community that we found out the invitations weren't just for the horror effect. Like, holy shit, guys, if you don't know already, this is how they get actors for the show. We actually get to attend the goddamn parties ourselves. I signed up via the link that one of the producers, I assume he was anonymous, posted on the community, and soon enough, both myself and my boyfriend were issued with honest-to-God postal invites. Proper fancy cardstock, wax seals, the lot. So, oh my God, the party is tonight, and I am so thrilled I could puke. I wonder what theme we'll get. Something really gory and violent, I hope. I'm looking forward to being split from tits to toes, as the host has said before. Or no, maybe I'll be the survivor. I don't know, however it plays out, I'm so excited. I love these ARG things. I love the idea of live escape the room games, and I love this goddamn podcast. We don't know where the party's being held yet. We all have to meet at a location outside of town, where a van will come and take us to the party proper. Excited to see who I'll be going with. Sometimes the groups are made up of existing friends. Sometimes they're all strangers. It varies. I don't really know much else about what to expect other than what the producer told me. I tried to get in touch with some of the past actors, partygoers, but I guess they must have signed non-disclosure agreements or something, because I can't track down any of the people I've heard on the podcast. The fandom's pretty obsessed with finding them, but so far we've come up empty. So yeah, the final party's tonight, and I've got my hottest horny teen horror movie dress ready, and I'm so hyped, you guys. I really hope there are some other Final Party fans on here, or if not, I really hope you check out the show. Our episode should be going up next week, I think, so by this time next Sunday, you'll all be able to listen to me get murdered horribly. Or survive, I guess. I just hope that either way, I don't die first. I'm really excited. I saw something on the evening news that I can't explain. My work friends and I were out at our favorite pub last night. Not a really fancy place, but, you know, cheap beer and close enough to home that I don't have to drive. The night started out normally enough. The four of us crammed into a small table off in the corner, mostly talking shop and shitting on our boss. Being this was the middle of the week, there weren't too many other people around. Maybe around 8 or 9 others in the whole place. Everybody just kind of keeping to themselves. Sort of people you'd expect to see in a pub on a Wednesday. Anyway, from where I'm sitting, I have a pretty good view of the TV behind the bar. Jesse, the bartender, is kind of lazily flipping through channels and passes by our local news channel. There's a brief burst of orange and red on the screen, which I register as a fire happening somewhere, which then disappears as Jesse switches over to the next channel. Something about the image looks oddly familiar, though. "Hey, Jess, can you switch that back?" I call out to her. The news comes back on, and suddenly I recognize the building in the frame. It's my building, and it's burning. "Holy shit," I say, loudly enough that a few people follow my gaze to the television. "That's my apartment." The crowd in the bar falls kind of quiet. Everybody's staring up at the screen now. The screen shows a wide shot of the outside of my building. The camera must be set up on the north end of the block because I recognize a lot of shops on the ground floor. Property management, dry cleaner, convenience mart, etc. The top left corner of the building is aflame. It's not a huge fire by any means, but it looks like a few units between the top 4 floors or so have already been engulfed by the flames. "Swing, man," one of my coworkers says. That sucks." There's an uncomfortable murmur of agreement that passes around the table. I mean, I don't blame them. I wouldn't know what to say in this situation either. "Yup," I agree just as awkwardly. Thankfully, my apartment is only about halfway up and located on the west side of the building. I cross my fingers, hoping my stuff will be okay. The camera cuts to a reporter on the scene. He's standing a little further away. Looking at the shops in the background, I can tell he's across the street on the northwest corner of the building. "Firefighters are expected on the scene any moment," he's saying, "and hopefully they'll be able to contain this horrible inferno before it spreads any further." As I was saying before, it's very fortunate that everyone was able to evacuate the building before things got too bad, or who knows what tragic events may have unfolded. "He's really laying it on thick," my other coworkers jokes. I chuckle a bit. All things considered, at the moment it really didn't seem all that bad. But then a few moments later, hang on, the reporter on TV says. "We're getting some updated information. It seems..." Hang on one moment while we readjust the camera. The previously locked down camera starts to shift, the angle focusing on an area of the building about halfway up the west side. All the lights in the building are out except for one. I feel a weird creeping sensation as I start counting the windows from the bottom. 5 up, 2 over. That's my place. I swore I turned that light out, I think at first. Then I see it. There's a person standing in my window. The camera is zoomed out too far to make out any features, but it definitely looks like a man, and it's definitely standing in my apartment. I watch petrified as the camera zooms in closer. The reporter babbling on about the overlooked, ill-fated soul still trapped in the blazing, such and such. As the image gets closer, I start to make out more details. The person is dancing or something. I don't really know how to describe it, but he's moving around a lot, and everything he's doing has this bizarre rhythmic quality to it. He starts waving his arms in the air, back and forth, and then he's waving them up and down at his sides. Then he's banging both fists on the glass. Then he's waving his arms over his head again, back and forth. Everything he's doing is to the exact same tempo. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. He starts jumping up and down, waving his arms over his head like he's trying to get someone's attention from a long distance. But everything is to the exact same rhythm, over and over again. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. What? I say, my voice a hoarse whisper. And then the camera gets a little closer, and finally we can make out the person's features. It looks almost exactly like me. It's wearing the exact same clothes that I'm wearing now. Clothes I changed into moments before leaving the apartment earlier. Its face looks almost exactly like mine as well, except for its eyes. Its eyes are far too big for a normal person. It also has this almost comical look of horror on its face. I don't even know how to describe it. Imagine if someone were pretending to look scared, but as a joke. It would have almost seemed funny if the circumstances were different, but instead it was just extremely unnerving. No one in the bar is talking now. Everyone is fixed on the TV. The person is still swaying and waving around, beating its hands on the glass or jumping in circles. I almost don't hear the reporter mention the fact that firefighters have rushed into the building and are now heading for my floor. Oh God, I think, without really understanding what was happening. Please don't go in there. I stare transfixed at the screen. From this angle, you can just barely see the top of my front door through the window, not too far behind where this creature is flailing around. Right now it is holding its face in his hands and shaking its head from side to side as if saying no. Suddenly the door behind it bursts open as, presumably, the firefighters have entered my apartment. The creature stops moving. For a second I see its expression change. The comical look of horror is gone, replaced by a huge smile filled with enormous, pointed teeth. Then the lights go out. We all just sat there, staring at the screen as the camera slowly zoomed out from the now dark window. No one says anything as we all quietly pay our bill and leave. I went directly to my sister's place across town and asked to stay with her. I told her there was a fire at my apartment, and that's it. When I tried to find footage from the news online later that night, it seemed like they had edited that last part out. I don't know if any of you on this subreddit know what that thing was, but I hope they didn't put out that fire. I hope they let the whole place burn to the ground.